Hey, have you ever seen a villainous smile when she gets dumped? Everyone expected tears, revenge, drama, but she just smiled, packed her things, and chose a quiet farm life. Too bad the story didn't plan to let her live in peace. And that's where this story begins. A crowd of students stands in a huge hall. They watch what is happening. A man named Christopher shouts at a girl named Silviana Melcarini. He points at her angrily. He tells her that he is breaking off their engagement. Silviana stands before the students, full of determination. Fear and confusion are visible on the students' faces. Silviana calmly replies to Christopher that she will gladly agree to the breakup of the engagement. At the same time, she is happy that she will finally be free. Christopher does not understand why the girl is so calm. He repeats what he said earlier, confused. Silviana turns to the man and says again that she gladly accepts the breakup of the engagement. Christopher is puzzled and decides to ask the girl why she is happy. After all, she risks losing her title of crown princess. He tells her that usually no one is happy about such a thing. The girl obediently agrees with him, but she explains her position. Silviana says that she has always hated the idea of marrying Christopher, and therefore she is grateful that he himself suggested canceling everything. The man is shocked by these words, and his face shows his incomprehension. Silviana asks him why he broke off the engagement. She continued and began to explain that Christopher had chosen to make the announcement at the graduation ceremony at St. Edine's Academy. And so the girl thinks that the man must have a very good reason for the breakup. The students around them continued to watch what was happening with blank faces of fear. Silviana suggested that Christopher wanted to publicly discredit her for some reason, and that this was the reason for the breakup. The man started shouting and revealed the real reason. He said it was all because Silviana had bullied Katia. At that moment, the man pointed to a blonde girl named Katia, who was standing behind him, hiding and looking frightened. Silviana did not feel guilty and did not believe Christopher's words. Katia was looking at Silviana from behind the man's back, her eyes filled with tears. In a quiet voice, Katia began to accuse Silviana and say that the girl hated her. In doing so, she confirmed Christopher's words. Silviana calls it trivial that she is being accused of crimes she never even thought of. In this case, the girl decides to fight back. Christopher stands next to Katia and calms her down. Silviana does not remember anything like this and explains her desire to fight back by saying that she was preparing for her engagement day. The girl says that she is a busy person and that she has no time for such nonsense. Christopher and Katia stand in front of her in shock. Christopher yells at Silviana that she tore Katia's textbook. Silviana begins to explain to him that textbooks are issued by the state. She calls herself an aristocrat and says that she would never damage state property. Silviana looks at Christopher and sincerely does not understand why she would need to damage Katia's textbook. The man explains the possible reason to her in a loud voice and says that Katia was like a thorn in her side. He goes on to list instances when Silviana bullied Katia. The man doesn't stop there and maliciously says that a week ago, Silviana pushed Katia down the stairs. Silviana indignantly replies that this is obvious. She does not understand why healing magic could not be used. The girl also added that, as far as she remembers, Lady Katia possesses this ability. The girl continues to argue that it was unfair and says that a week ago, she was not even at the academy. Therefore, the collision could not have happened. The people around stood next to the columns and thoughtfully pondered Silviana's words. Christopher, with a malicious grin, decided to take the opportunity to reproach Silviana and accused her of skipping classes. He asked her if that was really the case. Silviana's fan was definitely circling around her face in her hands. Suddenly, Silviana shouted to the whole room that she had been in the basement digging daikon. Christopher, Katia, and the people around them were horrified and in shock. Their faces showed sincere surprise at the girl's words. Christopher indignantly asked again about the daikon. Silviana stood motionless and surprisingly steadfast in front of everyone. She looked Christopher and Katia straight in the eye. The man asked about the daikon again and did not believe the girl's words. Silviana began to talk about the large ripe carrots that grew in the ground, not yet picked. The girl said that the vegetables there were delicious and very nutritious, adding that they were even used to make potions. There was not a trace of excitement on her face. Christopher took a vicious step forward, closer to Silviana, and shouted at her that that wasn't the point. He accused her of lying and said that students were not allowed to go into the dungeons outside of class. And you can't get an adventurer's license until you graduate from the academy. Katia continued to stand behind Christopher, afraid to move. Silviana took a card out of her lace fan with a slight movement of her hands and waved it. This was how she showed her greatness, authority, and righteousness. Calmly but loudly, she addressed Christopher and said that there were exceptions. She was referring to herself. She said she had been acting under a pseudonym. The girl waved her fan, her hair flying to the sides. Her face showed greatness. Her eyes burned with fire. She acted confidently and freely. Silviana shared her secret and explained that her adventurer name was Silverini, and she was an S-rank adventurer. She immediately asked him to remember it. Christopher stood rooted to the spot, greatly surprised by every word Silviana said. Katia stood behind him and was also unable to recover from shock. The man cried out in surprise that Silviana also had the title of S-rank adventurer. The girl continued to stand confidently in front of them. She said that when adventurers enter the dungeon, a record is kept, and this is proof of her alibi. But she had no time for such nonsense, and Silviana boldly asked if that was clear to Christopher. The man's gaze showed both surprise and anger at the same time. But Silviana calmly added that, in any case, their engagement was terminated by mutual consent. After that, she said that she was not going to attend the graduation ceremony in such an atmosphere. Apologizing and saying that it was time for her to go, she began to run away quickly. Her shoes clattered loudly on the stairs leading upstairs. The hem of her dress fluttered in the air from her sudden movements. Silviana left the ceremony. Everyone around her was in shock. When she reached the end of the stairs, the girl suddenly turned around. She began to look down on Christopher and Katia. She thanked Christopher for everything, but added that he had done nothing for her. Her gaze became sad. After that, she said goodbye to Christopher and curtsied elegantly. Behind Silviana, a bright light began to appear, illuminating her hair and the entire room around her. The crowd of students watched this spectacle, and no one understood what was happening, but everyone guessed that the girl was beginning to disappear. Someone in the crowd shouted that the teleportation circle had worked. Christopher clenched his fist in anger, looking very irritated. He was unhappy that Silviana had teleported and disappeared. Katia was frightened by Christopher's anger and turned to him. Silviana teleported to another room. After teleporting, Silviana waved her arms up and joyfully exclaimed that the annulment of the engagement was complete. The girl sat down on the bed and began to talk about her life during the engagement. She says that she spent 18 years in the Melcarini ducal family, 10 of which were spent in engagement. The girl happily reports that she had been waiting for this day for a long time and that she had held on well all this time. She was constantly seen with Christopher, whom she did not particularly like. Tea parties and social gatherings were only held with him. Even at the academy, Silviana constantly had to watch her behavior. The girl says that Christopher was crazy about Katia and completely ignored Silviana. Christopher and Katia were always flirting at the academy, for which the man graduated 2 years ago. Silviana recalls how Christopher called Katia the main character of this game and was outraged by such an attitude towards his bride. The girl finds this disgusting. She says that this is the world of a game called Love Dungeon, or Love Dan for short, and Silviana Melcarini calls herself the main villain in this game. She explains that the game Love Dungeon is an ambitious project that combines an RPG about clearing dungeons and a dating simulator. Silviana calls this game crappy, full of memes, with an incomprehensible target audience. In her past life, she found it amusing, so she played through it completely. In this game, Silviana mocks Katia in every way possible, and at the end of the story, she was executed. Depending on the plot branch, she could appear before the player as the final boss. But now Silviana intends to avoid the execution branch. The girl continues to tell the story of her life in this game with interest. On her 8th birthday, she realized that she had been reborn as a villain. Her parents did not understand what was happening to her and were genuinely frightened for her at that moment. For Silviana, this came as a surprise, but she believes that, in any case, she will avoid this death penalty and survive. And after that, she will do whatever she wants. Silviana's words and actions showed complete determination. She believes that the most important thing for survival is to become stronger. The girl had good characteristics, considering that she was a candidate for the final bosses. But from early childhood, she still asked her parents to organize training for her. Silviana says that in the original game, her parents were quite evil. She says that they are among the 7 great villains. But now they were so busy with their training that they had no time for villainy. And so their home began to prosper. Silviana believes that perhaps her parents' kindness and prosperity made them annoying. They often pestered her and asked her to train with them, surrounding her with too much care and love. Silviana continues her story and says that at the academy, she always tried to stay in the shadows, did not antagonize the main character, and was polite. But behind the scenes, she began her journey as an adventurer to carry out her plan for salvation. And now, the girl is jumping for joy, happy that her engagement to Christopher has been broken off. With the money she earned from this, she has already managed to buy a house and a farm. Silviana full of determination and confidence, announces the beginning of her own story. She joyfully throws open the window of her room, letting in bright sunlight. She is open to new adventures. Sylviana looks out the window and tells the world that from this moment on, her new, happy life begins. Sylviana rejoices in life and says that she will cultivate fields on a large farm, far from the capital and the hustle and bustle. Her curls flutter in the wind. She continues to dream and talk about growing her favorite vegetables and making sweets. Maybe she will even get a pet. Sylviana's words are filled with hope for a bright future. But the girl tries not to remember the past. She says that in her previous life, she died halfway to her dream. She explains that her good-natured personality, which made it impossible for her to refuse to help others, led her to become a temporary employee at a shady company. She doesn't even remember if it was due to overwork or an accident. Sylviana had only one dream. She dreamed of running a cafe in an old Japanese house with her older sister. Sylviana says she has been reborn in this strange world, but she is sure that this time she will definitely live the way she wants to, and she will never become the final boss. Her words reflected her former determination, and her eyes showed complete confidence. Sylviana turned away from the window and shouted joyfully that this was now her story. Little fairies and spirits flew around her, and the girl's power rose into the air. Suddenly, unexpectedly for the girl, her mother enters the room and calls her name sweetly. Sylviana's confidence quickly gave way to fear at her mother's unexpected appearance. The girl's mother says that she has moved here and asks her not to be afraid. She informs Sylviana that she is being summoned to the royal palace. She apologizes for interrupting her moment of freedom. Her mother thinks that perhaps they were not satisfied with the annulment of the engagement. Sylviana interrupts her mother and exclaims that everything has been done officially and that there will be no problems. Her mother asks again. The girl has already begun to think that a peaceful life is still far away. But despite this, she is confident in her actions and replies to her mother that she understands. The Melcarini ducal house, where Sylviana was born, is, on the one hand, a family with royal blood, and on the other, a family in which talented adventurers are often born. Sylviana's parents were very distinguished and looked stately. They sit next to each other, smiling sweetly, looking at Sylviana. Her mother tells her that she looks beautiful today. She adds that a nice dress is every lady's armor and sweetly addresses her daughter Sylvie. Sylviana stands in an elegant long dress, her hair neatly gathered. She returns to the castle after a day of freedom and realizes that her peaceful life is on hold. The girl thanks her mother for her warm words and compliments. Sylviana's father is unhappy that Prince Christopher announced the breakup of the engagement in front of everyone. He calls his actions nonsense. Sylviana replies that everything is going according to the game's plot. The girl's mother is delighted and says that Sylvie seemed to have foreseen the breakup of the engagement and bought a farm. She immediately adds that she will be lonely when Sylviana moves out. The girl's father sat pensively next to his wife. His gaze revealed his dissatisfaction. Sylviana replied calmly to her mother that with the help of the teleportation circle, they would always be able to visit each other. The girl recalled a recent incident when her mother teleported into the room. Her father reminded her that negotiations with the royal family would begin soon. He asked Sylviana if she had prepared anything for the negotiations. The girl answered in the affirmative, and her eyes showed her former determination. She was holding a small box in her hands. The girl said that she had prepared countermeasures for just such an occasion. She added that soon everyone would know whose word would be final. Her words held a heavy intrigue. The royal castle was lit by bright sunlight. The columns in the hall stood majestically. Sylviana Melcarini arrived at the castle and announced this. She was dressed in an elegant long dress, like a queen. Her face was calm and imperturbable. Immediately, a sharp and loud cry from Christopher was heard in the castle. He saw Sylviana and began to shout angrily at her that even if she had come to apologize, he would not cancel the annulment of their engagement. Sylviana looked at him and replied sarcastically that she had come so eagerly, thinking that she had been called to sign the papers. Christopher was very angry and was about to take his anger out on the girl. But suddenly, his younger brother Edgar, who was nearby, stopped him. His brother asked Christopher to calm down. Then he turned to Sylviana. In a serious tone, he reproached her for taking too many liberties, and he hastily asked where her respect for the royal family was. Sylviana and her parents stood there, a little frightened. The girl did not expect such a sharp and harsh reaction from Edgar. She had previously thought that Christopher's younger brother was normal, but now Sylviana noticed his stern, angry gaze. Given the situation, Sylviana began to think that Edgar now definitely considered her an enemy. Edgar Bernium is the second prince and Sylviana's classmate. He is 2 years younger than Christopher. The girl talks about this and honestly admits that she doesn't know him at all. She says that, being engaged, she tried not to have any contact with him. She adds that Edgar was a minor character in the game. Sylviana continues her story and says that Christopher is 20 years old and was able to get close to Katia, who is 2 years younger than him. Sylviana says indignantly that there will always be such sociable people, referring to Christopher and Katia. She didn't like that the two were getting close. At this point, Edgar stands in front of Sylviana and tells her that after the recent graduation, there was quite a commotion. He agrees that Christopher's actions are not commendable, but he believes that everything could have been resolved more peacefully. Edgar and Christopher stood side by side and were angry at Sylviana. She replied that she also did not reveal her adventurous personality of her own free will. She tried to assure the guys that she wanted with all her heart to somehow resolve the situation. Suddenly, Edgar shouted loudly and angrily at Sylviana and told her not to make excuses. The girl flinched in fear and did not understand what was happening to the man. She tried to find out why Edgar was so enraged. Was it because his brother had been humiliated? Sylviana came to the conclusion that something didn't add up in this whole situation. The king sat on his throne next to the young man. He ordered everyone to calm down and explained that he was also confused. He added that it was not possible to simply break off the engagement. Christopher agreed with him and said that he had all the evidence of Sylviana's misdeeds. He was very angry, waving his arms in rage. A servant appeared and brought all the evidence. On the table lay a stack of papers, a damaged textbook, and many other items. Sylviana looked at the pile and said that it was not evidence, but simply a pile of damaged items. She stood calmly and elegantly waved her lace fan. The textbook on the table was covered in ink, and some pages were torn. Damaged clothes lay nearby. Christopher accused Sylviana and told her that, according to Katia, she had done it. He also added that Katia's injury was also the girl's fault. Sylviana reminded Christopher that she had been in the basement that day. The man shouted that the whole story was complete nonsense. He didn't know how Sylviana had achieved S rank, and he wouldn't believe it without proof. Christopher began pointing his finger at the girl angrily. She thought to herself that Christopher was very restless. Sylviana's gaze showed confidence in her actions. She opened her box in front of the guy. Inside, small shiny crystals lay neatly arranged. She said that with the help of these time crystals, she would be able to show Christopher everything. As Sylviana explained, a time crystal is a medium for information created from magical energy. In the game, it is used as a storage item. It is very expensive. Christopher began to tearfully recount Sylviana's misdeeds. He said that a year ago, Katia enrolled in the academy, and on that day, Sylviana pushed her into a pond. Katia managed to escape only because Christopher happened to be nearby. He put his hand on his heart and bowed his head. He continued to say that Katia is a commoner who discovered her healing magic after enrolling in the Academy of Saint Edine. The man believed that it was not easy for her to earn respect. Sylviana did not believe the guy's story and began to argue the opposite. She said that she had been present at the entrance ceremony that day as a student representative. As soon as it was over, she went to the dungeon and therefore did not even approach the pond. Christopher did not believe her. He continued to praise Katia and say that she was very hardworking, that she not only studied and trained diligently, but also practiced singing assiduously. But one day, according to Christopher, someone tore up Katia's sheet music. Sylviana began to say again that she was innocent. She explained that she was on the executive committee of the school festival, and because of the preparations, her entire month was busy every minute. Christopher began to stumble and continued to list the facts that incriminated Sylviana. But the girl, in turn, interrupted him and proved her innocence. She looked at the crystals of time and appeared very confident. The man standing in front of the table fell silent. But suddenly he slammed his fist on the table. He loudly protested that it was not at all as Katia had described. Sylviana responded calmly. She said that he had been deceived. After Sylviana's words, Christopher's gaze was filled with horror. He leaned his hands on the table in front of him and refused to believe it. He said that Katia couldn't possibly have lied to him. Edgar stood silently, watching his brother's anger. Then he began to speak, quite calmly, saying that time crystals were very expensive. He did not understand the need to prepare such a large quantity of them and record all events. Edgar's face was pensive. Sylviana looked at him silently. Edgar began to suspect that Sylviana knew something. It was as if she knew that something was going to happen and was deliberately preparing the crystals. Sylviana covered her face with a lace fan and quietly remarked that Edgar was much smarter than his brother. The girl began to justify herself, saying that she needed the crystals for protection. She said that there were many who did not like the strengthening of ties between the Melcarini family and the royal family. If she was not careful, the reputation of the Christopher family would suffer. Sylviana explained that she always recorded all her words and actions. That way, no one could frame her. She continued her thought and said that someone had falsely accused her of bullying Katia. Christopher stood in horror and listened to this. Meanwhile, Sylviana continued to say that there was nothing reprehensible about her actions. She hoped she had managed to prove it. Edgar and Christopher looked at the girl fiercely and angrily, not believing her. But she already knows that before she leaves, she will have to repay them in full. Although Sylviana calls herself a villain, she is not going to listen to accusations of something she did not do. She clutched the fan tightly in her hand. The girl informed everyone present that what was happening in the hall was also being recorded on the Crystal of Time. The box was open at that moment. She immediately turned to Christopher and asked if he wanted to look at his pitiful reflection in the crystals. The man did not expect such words and began to shout again, but did not have time to finish his thought. Sylviana interrupted him and said that it was because of her that he still blamed others. She tells Christopher that forgetting the dignity of the royal family, falling head over heels in love with a woman, and ultimately being deceived has crossed all boundaries of what is permissible. The man leaned heavily on the table and could not control himself because of his rage. Sparks of evil flashed from his eyes. Sylviana declared that this shameful moment would be forever engraved in the history of the royal family. She smiled maliciously and looked Christopher in the eyes. Edgar stood next to him and addressed Sylviana. He sternly told her that she was going too far. The girl immediately replied that she did not consider it necessary to show respect to someone who had announced the cancellation of the engagement under such circumstances. The girl turned to her parents. Then she yelled at the guys that having an affair with another girl while engaged was the height of meanness. At that moment, Sylviana looked very stately and majestic. She tried to completely extinguish Christopher and prove her point. She pointed her lace fan downwards, showing that Christopher's actions and behavior were very low. The man was desperate and furious. Edgar stood with his mouth open. The king sat on his throne and was horrified by what he heard. Sylviana's mother turned to His Majesty and said that the engagement would have to be broken off after all. She, too, was not generous enough to forgive when her daughter was being slandered. The girl's father added that they also had to think about whom to swear allegiance to. Sylviana's parents tried to calm her down. The girl's mother said that the thought of him being their future king frightened her. Sylviana agreed and noticed that her mother had put on a wicked face. The girl was very happy that this time her peaceful life would definitely begin. In the meantime, she wanted compensation. The king did not expect to hear such words. Sylviana explained that she had been falsely accused and that the engagement had been broken off. She stated that the royal family should take responsibility and compensate her for the damage. Suddenly, Christopher furiously and sarcastically ordered Sylviana to stop making him laugh. He was very angry. Suddenly, a bright fire began to appear in his hands. Everyone in the hall was very surprised and a little frightened. The magical fire in Christopher's hands began to grow upward. The man raised his hand and directed all his fury upward. Edgar was standing nearby, wanting to calm his brother down and ask him what he was doing. Sylviana was also surprised by Christopher's magical fire. She wanted to know how a prince who did not have much magic could create such a large fireball. She was curious to know how hard he had trained. Edgar tried to stop his brother, but Christopher ordered him not to interfere. The king addressed Christopher sternly and angrily, asking him about his actions. They were clearly frightened and angry. Meanwhile, Christopher's anger was growing. The magical fireball only grew in size and power. He directed the fire towards Sylviana. The girl stood silently, wondering what Christopher meant. Did he hate or despise her? The fireball flew straight at her, but the girl made it clear that she didn't care. She didn't care about the prince's magic. Nothing could disturb her calm gaze. The girl decided to end this quickly. She raised her hands, and her magic quickly began to work in the air. Sylviana was able to catch the fireball flying toward her. Christopher was very surprised by this and did not expect it. He realized that the girl was going to throw the ball. Suddenly, there was a powerful and loud bang. Sylviana shouted powerfully and sent the magical fireball back forward. Fire scattered through the air. The girl wanted to aim the ball directly at Christopher, but deliberately decided to miss. And the fireball crashed into the castle wall, causing the entire wall to crack. The cracks appeared very quickly and sharply. Christopher's face was horrified and frightened. He fell to his knees and looked fearfully at the cracked wall. Then Sylviana shouted and created a water spear in her hands. She aimed it right where the fireball had been flying. As a result, new cracks appeared on the wall, and Christopher was devastated. The girl sarcastically said that she had almost been killed and joked that she had been very scared. Sylviana's parents watched everything that was happening, but they weren't angry. Her mother said that Sylvie could have incinerated Christopher in the blink of an eye. And her father added that the prince should learn compassion from the girl who deliberately missed her target. Edgar and the king were horrified. Sylviana turned to his majesty and asked for increased compensation after what had happened. The king clutched his head, lowered his gaze, and had to agree to the increased compensation. Edgar's gaze showed only rage and fear. Sometime later, in the morning, Sylviana is in a simple village house. She is sitting in simple clothes at a table with a cup of tea. Bright, warm sunlight shines through the window. In front of the girl are buns and various delicacies. She happily wished herself bon appetit. She is finally beginning the peaceful life she has always dreamed of. A quiet village town where you wake up in the morning to the sound of birds singing. No hairstyles or fancy clothes, just breakfast and simple attire. The girl thinks it's amazing. She holds a cup in her hands and muses dreamily. Her face is very calm and positive. Sylviana thinks about what she should do now and enjoys her peaceful life. But suddenly her enjoyment is interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Sylviana didn't know who had come to see her in the morning and ran to open the door. Edgar is standing on the doorstep with a stern expression on his face. Sylviana was immediately frightened. She slammed the door as soon as she saw him, and she ran away. Through the closed door, Edgar addressed her and ordered her to open the door. The girl decided to pretend and said that he had mistaken her door for someone else's. Her face showed not only fear, but also indignation. She was tense and wondered what he was doing there and why he had come at all. Sylviana returned and opened the door for Edgar. The man calmly admitted that he had come to apologize. Sylvie said sadly that if he thought he could buy her forgiveness with apologies, he was mistaken. Edgar replied that he was sorry for his behavior. He said he shouldn't have behaved that way toward a girl whose engagement had been broken off unilaterally. He immediately bowed respectfully to the girl and asked for her forgiveness. Sylviana did not expect to hear an apology. But almost immediately, Edgar began to raise his voice at her and declare that Sylviana's inappropriate behavior in front of the royal family was a separate issue. Sylviana tensed up and stared wide-eyed. Edgar continued that if she had shown disrespect to his older brother, it would have been a serious offense. The girl did not respond, but she mentally agreed that she had definitely gone too far that time, insulting the whole family. She did not consider it to be something serious and important and pretended to be sorry. After a moment of silence, the man suddenly asked what Sylviana was up to in this quiet place. The girl thought for a moment and didn't understand the question at first. Edgar stated sharply that this house was his territory, and he didn't remember giving the girl permission to live here. Sylviana was even more surprised and even stunned. She thought this place had nothing to do with the royal family. She replied to Edgar that she knew nothing about it, putting on a calm expression. Edgar said she was lying, but the girl tried to convince him that she was telling the truth. The man began to reason and say that he understood why she had decided to move to the countryside after such a scandal. He added that she should have chosen a place that was not connected to the royal family. He said this in a stern tone and pointed his finger at Sylviana. Then he raised his voice and asked the girl if, since this house was an enclave, she wouldn't be caught. At that moment, Sylviana thought she had escaped. Edgar continued and confidently suggested that the girl was plotting something here. He asked if it was the overthrow of the state. Sylviana was outraged. She shouted that the engagement had been broken off and that it was her fault. She loudly asked him not to make her out to be the villain. They were both angry with each other. But Edgar realized that he was wrong and that she was not to blame for the breakup of the engagement and apologized again. Sylviana wondered if it was normal for a member of the royal family to apologize so easily. She was sure it was strange. She wanted to give him a clear explanation. And Sylviana began to tell Edgar that she had always dreamed of a quiet life. Edgar listened and asked questions. The girl continued and said that she just wanted to live quietly, grow vegetables in her garden, and cook with them. She didn't need anything else. Edgar seemed skeptical. He was tired of listening to Sylviana's dreams. Suddenly, the girl finished her story and pushed the man away. She told him to go back to his place because there was nothing to see here. She said that her compensation could be paid once a month. Edgar wanted to stop her and said that they hadn't finished their conversation yet. Suddenly, he fell down, right into the teleportation circle. The man was very frightened and did not expect this. Sylviana could only think about how Edgar had tired her with his apologies. The next day, Sylviana heard a knock on the door again. This time she opened the door and saw Edgar again. From the doorway, he told her that yesterday she had forcibly brought him back to the royal palace. The girl did not want to see him. Edgar's face was serious. Sylviana asked why he had come. The man replied that he could not come to terms with their conversation yesterday and did not understand how the duke's daughter would work in the fields. Sylviana calmly replied that if that was the case, he could see for himself today. She said that she was just about to start planting today. Edgar was a little upset by her behavior and words, but he did not argue. They came to a field, which was very large. Meadows stretched out in front of them, trees grew, and the sun shone brightly. Edgar looked and asked Sylviana if she could handle such a large field on her own. Sylviana said that first she would decide what to plant there. She began a list and said that she wanted to plant carrots, potatoes, corn, and tomatoes. For fruit, she wanted apple trees, orange trees, lemon trees, and strawberries. Edgar looked at her indignantly. The girl picked up a basket of seeds and said that it would be better to start with vegetables from the basement. Edgar looked at the basket and asked what it was. Sylviana replied that they were seeds and seedlings from the underground. The girl began to explain that plants growing in the underground are usually more nutritious than those on the surface, but they are also more expensive. If you transplant them to the surface, they will dry out and not produce another crop. Therefore, it is necessary to prepare several fields for cultivation in turn. The girl herself did not know who had created such a complex system, but she said that in any case, everything had to be prepared first. And first, water. Edgar and Sylviana approached the well. Suddenly, Sylviana waved her hand and summoned Aqua. Aqua, the spirit of water, appeared. She was a small fairy with light hair, dressed in a cute, cheerful dress. Edgar's mouth opened in surprise at the sight of the spirit. Sylviana asked Aqua to fill the well with clean water. Immediately, a beautiful spiral jet of water filled the well in an instant. The girl was in a good mood, while the prince stood slightly behind her, not understanding what was happening. After that, Sylviana summoned Terra, the spirit of the earth. An old man in a robe with a thick mustache appeared. The girl asked Terra to make her land fertile so that even underground plants could grow well there. Edgar was even more surprised by the spirit of the earth. Terra fulfilled Sylviana's command. The prince did not expect her to have a contract with two spirits. He said that making a contract with a spirit was not easy in itself. And even in this case, it was only possible to make a contract with a spirit close to her element. He added that water and earth were unthinkable, and asked the girl how she had made a contract with two at once. Sylviana replied with a surprised look that it wasn't quite like that. She summoned Ignis, the spirit of fire. Then she summoned Ventus, the spirit of wind. Sylviana informed Edgar that she had made contracts with all four elements at once because it was more convenient. The spirits of fire and earth flew to the girl's right, and the spirits of water and wind flew to her left. Edgar looked very surprised and even indignant. There was horror in his eyes. The spirit of fire asked Sylviana why she had summoned him. She apologized and said that she just wanted to introduce all the spirits to the prince. But immediately the girl found something for it to do and asked it to take care of the seeds. The spirit immediately obeyed Sylviana's orders. Edgar stood silently, wondering at what was happening. But then he said that he had never heard of anyone controlling all four great spirits for the purpose of agriculture. This was different from the farm Edgar had imagined. Meanwhile, the girl deftly distributed tasks to the spirits and managed their work. Seeds were scattered, water was poured, and the wind and earth were put to good use. Edgar continued. He addressed the girl as an S-rank adventurer and asked how much magic she had. Sylviana replied that this was her plan for achieving a peaceful life. She uses her magic not for adventure, but for herself. She had completed enough assignments for the royal court in her time. Edgar clarified. From the royal court? Sylviana admitted that, in fact, it was the former king who had encouraged her to become an adventurer. He was Edgar and Christopher's grandfather. Edgar did not know this and was very surprised. Sylviana continued telling the story. She said that 2 years ago, the former king recognized her abilities. In exchange for a certain reward, she was granted an adventurer's license as a special exception. All this was done to provide the crown prince with nutritious vegetables from the dungeon. Edgar guessed what the daikon was for. Sylviana confirmed this. She said that they both benefited, since she got the money anyway. But it was a hellish life for her. Edgar listened with interest and asked clarifying questions. Sylviana continued. For the duke's daughter to be an adventurer was a scandal in itself. Clients don't like that either. The girl explained that this was why she secretly lived a triple life as a student, an adventuress, and the duke's daughter, all for the good of the royal family. She said that all this came to an end when the engagement was broken off. Her parents told her not to come back for a while. Sylviana took advantage of this opportunity to leave the ranks of adventurers, and now lives here, in this simple house. Tears welled up in the girl's eyes. She said sadly that she had lost everything and had come to this rural town. She thought it was time for her to start living for herself. Was that so bad? Edgar stood silently. He realized that Sylviana had no home to return to, and it was all because of his family. He was also to blame for her downfall. Suddenly, the girl's tears stopped. She said she was joking. It was all a lie. She easily wiped away her last tear. Sylviana said that her parents would never have kicked her out. On the contrary, they praised her and allowed her to go to the village to rest. She asked Edgar if she didn't deserve a break. She explained that she just wanted some peace and quiet. The prince stood silently, but then he turned around with a sad look and said he was leaving. Sylviana was very happy that he was leaving. She didn't know why everything had turned out this way. Edgar had his own storyline in the game. He was very popular among users, despite his secondary role. He wasn't even one of the main love interests of the main character. Sylviana accepted his departure. It didn't matter much to her. She declared that Sylviana's work as a villain was done, and that from now on, Sylvie's free life would begin. She turned to the spirits and majestically added that it was time to get to work. The spirits worked hard in the fields, carrying baskets of vegetables and watering the ground. The next day came. Someone knocked on the door again, and Prince Edgar was standing on the threshold again. Sylviana was tired of his visits. Edgar said that something didn't add up and that he still didn't believe the girl. Sylviana replied that the man had already apologized and agreed with her, and asked what he wanted from her again. Edgar replied that, as the lord of this land, he was obliged to keep an eye on someone as dangerous as Sylviana. He said that there was a possibility that Sylviana would decide to run away and his men would not be able to catch up with her. The girl was horrified by what she heard. Edgar raised his stern voice and told her that until her innocence was proven, he would continue to visit the house. Sylviana thought she would explode with rage at Edgar. She pushed him away sharply and forcefully, asking him to leave. Edgar shouted, "How could they leave an S-rank adventurer unattended?" Sylviana shouted back that she was no longer an adventurer. Edgar replied that this was still doubtful. Sylvie's house and farm were located not far from the town of Erdei. A narrow path led past a low wooden fence and a well. Aqua had already prepared the well. Sylviana wanted to rebuild the fence. Further away from the well were the beds where the girl was going to plant potatoes. Then there was a large two-story house with enough rooms for Sylviana. Next to the house was a pen where chickens were to be kept, and fruit trees were planted throughout Sylviana's property. In the distance, high mountains and fields could be seen. The spirits were already beginning their work and carrying out Sylviana's orders. Early in the morning, the girl stretches sweetly. She rejoices in the good weather and says that it is an ideal day for a leisurely life. A small, simple handbag hangs from her shoulder. Edgar has already come to her and asked what she's going to do today. The man was standing near the entrance, and Sylviana noticed him as soon as she came out. She was surprised by his arrival. Edgar reminded her that he would be watching her. Sylviana told him about her plans and said she was going to the city of Erdei. She needed to stop by the adventurer's village and tell them about her move. She began to complain that she wanted to leave early, but someone came to see her every day and disturbed her. She hinted at Edgar and turned toward the village. Edgar followed her, and they both set off. Sylviana didn't particularly want to talk to him. She informed him that, by the way, she was a young lady who lived alone. Edgar began to get angry and tense up. He sternly said that if Sylvie didn't like it, she could chase him away with a teleportation circle, just like last time. Sylviana asked in surprise how she could chase away a member of the royal family. She added that creating a teleportation circle was not an easy task either. The girl walked a little ahead of the man, not showing any interest in him. A teleportation circle is a spell that allows one to instantly move to a predetermined location. It requires a large amount of magical power to both draw and activate. Sylviana believes that creating a teleportation circle is convenient but very troublesome. Edgar was surprised that the girl was going to walk to Erdei. She answered in the affirmative. She explained that it was spring, and the girl wanted to take a leisurely walk on her own 2 feet. Sylviana and Edgar walked past beautiful flowering trees. The air smelled of flowers, and lush grass grew all around. Edgar looked up, breathed in the fresh spring scent, and agreed with the girl. The sky was clear, and clouds floated gently in the wind. Sylviana said that it was a 20-minute walk to the city and asked if the prince would like to go with her. He immediately replied that it was no problem. He politely asked the girl not to look down on him just because he was from the royal family. Sylviana said that wasn't the case, but she didn't want to argue with the prince, so she simply agreed with him and let him think what he wanted. Petals and leaves from the trees fluttered around them, and the world around them was filled with the sense of spring. Erdei was a rural town near the border. The houses that were close together, and all the residents knew each other. Sylviana and Edgar arrived in the town. The girl was immediately given a hot dog on a tray and apologized for the wait. Sylvie was very happy about this hot dog and said that it was made at the kiosk she had been dreaming about. She really wanted to try it and immediately started eating it. Edgar stood a little behind her and was a little surprised. Sylvie enjoyed the fluffy hot bun and juicy sausage. The girl was very happy with this hot dog. It stood in front of the stall. Edgar decided to remind her that they were going to the guild. Sylviana interrupted him, apologized, and asked the vendor for another hot dog. The vendor quickly made a second serving and gave it to her. Sylvie handed the hot dog to Edgar, saying that in a peaceful life, rushing is forbidden. Edgar's face immediately brightened, and his expression changed. He tried the hot dog and became as happy as Sylviana. And now they're eating hot dogs together. The vendor struck up a conversation with the girl and asked her if she had finished moving to the farm. Sylviana replied that yes. She was now also a resident of Erdei and was counting on the support of the residents. He replied that she could always turn to him for help. Suddenly, a few young guys nearby called out to Sylviana. They approached her and told her that their group was going underground for the first time today and asked Sylvie for help. Then an unfamiliar grandmother also approached Sylviana with a request to look after their children, who were going on their first mission today. The girl replied that if Han asked, she couldn't refuse. She added that if she went with the boys, she would feel at ease. The residents were grateful to her. Edgar and Sylvie continued along the path. The prince asked Sylviana if everyone knew her here. He was surprised that she did not hide her status as the duke's daughter. The girl replied that famous adventurers were like celebrities here. At that moment, all the residents of Erdei who were passing by warmly greeted Sylviana, shouting after her and waving their hands. She waved and smiled back at them. In this world, there's a system of adventurers. Adventurers with an E/F rank are beginners, from those who have just received their license to security guards. Those with a C/D rank are intermediate, exploring dungeons that have already been explored. A AB rank is high level, exploring dangerous dungeons. S-rank adventurers have the highest combat and adventure potential in the country. Sylviana said that there weren't many S-rank adventurers in a village like this, and everyone treated her kindly, even though she was a stranger here. The girl went on to say that when she became an adventurer, she wanted to find a cozy place, and in the end, she chose this area, although she didn't know who was in charge here. At that moment, she glanced sideways at Edgar. The prince was walking behind her, listening to her story. After a while, they arrived at the Adventurers Guild. It was a tall, triangular building with many windows, columns, and arches. The young people sat down on a large leather sofa in the middle of a room filled with books, shelves, and plants. They were greeted by the guild master, an elderly man of short stature with a beard and glasses. He greeted Sylvie and immediately noticed Edgar. Sylviana thought that ordinary people don't often see the third prince, and the guild master was no exception. Meanwhile, the guild master said he was very happy to see them, but unfortunately, he couldn't offer them tea. He asked the girl why Edgar had come with her. Sylviana replied that she had broken with her past and moved to her estate to live independently, and Edgar had simply followed her. She pointed at him. The girl turned to the master and said that since he knew it was the prince's estate, he could have at least warned her about it. The guild master disagreed with her and began to say that the girl had fallen in love with the house the moment she saw it. She suggested that to avoid unnecessary fuss, Lord Edgar should pretend to be a novice adventurer. The prince did not like this idea and called it nonsense. Edgar said that even though he had been trained at the academy, he was still a novice. His expression was dissatisfied. He turned to the master, apologized for disturbing him, and asked for his assistance. Sylviana sat nearby and did not understand why Edgar was bowing to the master again. Suddenly, the prince turned to Sylvie and asked if the master knew who she really was. Sylviana replied that he did, because he had been taking care of her for 3 years. 3 years ago, the girl was brought to this master and asked him to take care of her. The guild master said that at first he was surprised that the duke's daughter was an adventurer. But when it comes to the Melcarini family, this is not surprising. The Melcarini ducal house has been famous for its warriors for generations. The founder of the house originally belonged to the royal family, but left it, declaring that he wanted to become an adventurer. He became famous as a hero of the highest rank, and after retiring, he received the title of duke. Sylviana's parents were the same. Her mother, although a commoner, was a master of healing magic and a first-class fighter. She was nicknamed the Bloody Saint. Her father fell in love with her at first sight and won her hand in marriage. Aristocrats are born with a large reserve of magical power. So many of them study martial arts and become adventurers. However, after graduation, almost all of them enter public service or work in a temple. Only a few actually become adventurers, because it's barbaric work. Even Sylviana thinks she has a strange family. The master is sorry that the girl is really leaving the adventurers. She sat on the sofa, holding a cup of tea in her hands, sipping it slowly, while the prince sat next to her. Sylviana said that instead of such dangerous work, she wants a more peaceful life. Being an adventurer is the fastest way to earn money, so the girl completed all the tasks in the city. She said that she had already earned enough money to run a farm in the future, and her long-awaited peaceful life had already begun. Sylvie continued to rejoice, but Edgar looked at her suspiciously. He wondered how she could have earned enough money in 3 years as an adventurer to buy a huge plot of land, a house, and cover other expenses. In addition, to prove her innocence, she bought up expensive time crystals in bulk. They say that one day of using such a crystal costs as much as the monthly expenses of a family of 4, and she bought enough for about a year. Edgar's thoughts continued to flow. He believed that this would require a fairly large team. In addition, until recently, she had been combining this with her studies. The prince was puzzled as to how much work it would take to save up that much money. He put his hands to his head. Edgar, like a spoiled boy, could hardly imagine all the hardships of labor. Sylviana saw that the prince was deep in thought. She asked what was troubling him so much. Edgar replied confusedly that it was nothing. She said that if anything happened, she would help the prince and asked him not to hesitate to ask her for help, for example, during an invasion. A great invasion is an incident in which, for some reason, monsters appear en masse. But Sylviana immediately pointed out that this happens extremely rarely. She tells the guild master that she will work part-time, as if it were a side job. The girl explained that she simply couldn't stand by and watch when someone was in trouble. She talked about it very cheerfully, but the prince continued to sit in amazement. He couldn't understand why Sylviana considered S-rank to be just a side job. There was horror in his eyes. One incredible story after another from Sylvie. It seemed that her abilities were truly beyond the ordinary. With such power, she could earn even more money, or even overthrow the state. And yet Sylviana wanted to give it all up and retire. The prince's thoughts were very strange. He did not understand Sylviana's actions. He thought she was plotting something, but the girl looked very happy. Suddenly, a cry for help was heard outside the window. The guild master heard noise in the nearby square. Sylviana immediately jumped up and quickly ran to see what had happened outside. Edgar also came to his senses and asked her to wait, and ran after her. Both ran out of the guild and into the square. There was a huge crowd of people around. An elderly woman named Han called out to Sylviana. The girl asked Mrs. Han what had happened. Mrs. Han asked Sylvie in a frightened voice to help and save her son. The girl tried to calm Han down and sat down in front of her. Mrs. Han began to tell her everything from the beginning. Her son wanted to obtain an adventurer's license. Han asked him to find an escort, but her son seemed to have gone into the dungeon on his own. The woman added that they were surrounded by monsters and couldn't get out, according to those who had managed to escape. Both the girl and the prince were very frightened. Another resident ran up and was outraged by what Han's son had done, calling him a fool. This resident had always told him that beginners needed an experienced guide to enter the dungeon. Several other residents began to calm Mrs. Han down. Anyone who passes the exam can obtain an adventurer's license. But real combat is a completely different matter. Edgar began to say to himself that during practice they also went to the dungeons, but it was not suitable for beginners. Perhaps that was why school rules prohibited obtaining a license before graduation. The residents turned to Mrs. Han and said that this is what happens when you overestimate your strength, referring to her son. But Mrs. Han continued to cry bitterly. Suddenly, Sylviana shouted that she understood and could help. She pointed to the side and showed her confidence. She asked to submit a rescue request to the guild. She asked which dungeon the woman's son had gone to. The resident replied that he had gone to the South Forest dungeon. Sylviana became alarmed and said that the strongest monsters were found in those parts. And Urdii was full of other dungeons for beginners. Edgar stood there scared. Sylviana clutched her head. The girl quickly said that she did not possess the magic of resurrection, so they should hurry. Mrs. Han continued to cry and was frightened by Sylviana's words about resurrection. She was not ready to accept that her son might die. Her eyes showed intense despair. Suddenly, Edgar stopped Sylviana. He sternly told her that she was unarmed and that it would be reckless to go like that. The girl reassured him and said that everything was fine. She took her signature lace fan out of her pocket and showed it to the prince. But the prince asked angrily what the girl was going to do with the fan. She waved the fan sharply in the air. Sylvie said that she didn't want to use the teleportation circle, but now every second counted. As a result, a magical teleportation circle formed on the ground. Sylviana stood in the center of it and was about to vanish. But Prince Edgar suddenly ran up to Sylvie. He shouted that he would go with her. The girl shouted back and agreed. They were very confident and both stood in the teleportation circle. Edgar realized that he would be able to see for himself what Sylviana was really capable of. And so, in the middle of the square, Sylvie and Edgar disappeared into the magic circle, while other people watched them and believed in the best. Edgar and Sylviana found themselves in front of the Great South Forest Dungeon. This large structure with tall, wide doors, decorated with flowers and plants, is a cave. Sylviana said that they needed to rescue these novice adventurers as soon as possible. They entered the dungeon. This is the name given to ruins or caves that harbor magical powers. Mysterious beings created by Edine as a test for humanity live there. This is known from the official website of Love and Dungeon. Edgar quietly says on the way that this is his first time entering a dungeon outside of training. The kids ran across the tiled surface, and there wasn't a soul around. Sylviana pointed out that the road was good here, so they would get there quickly. The dungeon Sylvie entered at the age of 10 was damp, and the floor was slippery, and the girl called it a horror. Edgar was very surprised that she had entered the dungeon at the age of 10. Sylviana explained that her parents had thrown her there and had given her only a knife. She also fell off cliffs and was washed away into the sea. According to the girl, she herself asked to be trained without leniency, but it still wasn't very pleasant. The prince listened to this and was horrified, but Sylviana calmly continued her story. Her mother is a master of resurrection magic, which is why she has trouble with breaks. Edgar was frightened by the fact that Sylviana had been resurrected. She confirmed that it had happened, but advised against getting involved in it because it was painful. Edgar was shocked by her family. He noticed that the monsters weren't appearing at all and asked fearfully if it was possible for them to be gone for so long. Sylvie replied that the monsters couldn't come out even if they wanted to. Edgar was surprised. The girl explained that she was currently using her intimidation skill. This is a skill that demonstrates the power of an adventurer. Low-level monsters lose their fighting spirit and cannot move. Edgar was surprised and thought that this was magic that only dungeon bosses could use. Sylviana said that they had been taught this skill in class and called it very useful. But the prince sternly stated that the intimidation skill should not be used lightly. He remained vigilant and looked around carefully. The prince keeps his hand on his sword, so he can attack at any moment and strictly adheres to the basics of adventuring. Sylviana thinks that His Highness Edgar constantly doubts her abilities. But she believes that this is right, because it is better not to believe the words of others, but to trust your own eyes. The girl considers Edgar a worthy fighter. The prince walks along, frowning, very serious and attentive. Suddenly, they heard a sharp cry, and they ran further along the tiled road straight into a large open room that resembled ruins made of mountains of stones. Sylviana was the first to approach the entrance and peered carefully out from behind the wall to discreetly assess the danger. They saw large stones in front of them, around which many monsters resembling wolves were walking. Next to these rocks lay novice adventurers who needed help. They looked exhausted and emaciated. Blood glistened on the walls and other surfaces. One of the students was trying to call for help, but the monsters were tormenting him. Edgar was shocked by what he saw, very frightened, and wanted to say something. But Sylviana interrupted him and ordered him not to move. She asked the prince if he knew how monsters thought. He replied that monsters instinctively eat people. Sylviana replied that this was true, that they only saw people as prey. The monsters' eyes were furious and evil at that moment. They were hungry. The girl came up with a plan and shouted that if a more attractive target appeared, the monster's attention would shift to her. Sylviana jumped sharply into the air and shouted for everyone to close their eyes for 5 seconds. Her purse fell to the floor, and Edgar's eyes filled with even greater surprise. Sylvie's eyes sparkled. Magic was in her hands. Her actions were very confident. Charm. She waved her lace fan, standing on the tallest and largest rock. All the monsters immediately turned their attention to her and saw her as potential prey. Edgar watched Sylviana's flashes of light and magic, but the monsters did not miss the opportunity to catch their prey and immediately began to attack the girl. Edgar was very frightened and shouted at her, asking if she was really going to fight the monsters alone, while he was just a porter. But the girl proudly replied that she was not alone. At that very moment, Ventus and Ignis, the spirits of air and fire, appeared at her call. Sylviana ordered the spirits to destroy the monsters. Together, they began to fight, but Ignis suddenly declared to Ventus that he would not give up this battle to her. But Ventus reminded the spirit of fire that they were, in fact, working as a team. Sylviana asked the spirits to stop arguing and do everything quickly. Prince Edgar was stunned that even in such a dangerous situation, the girl began to lecture the spirits. The battle raged on. The loud cries of the spirits and the growls of the monsters could be heard. Blood, magic screams. The prince began to rescue the injured novice adventurers, approaching them and asking about their condition. One of the students looked very bad. He was lying curled up near a rock, bleeding profusely. The prince said that thank God everyone was alive. He called out to Sylviana. and ordered her to finish off all the monsters they had missed, to strike with all her might. Sylvie confidently waved her fan upward. She jumped down to the ground and killed all the remaining monsters. It looked spectacular. The last monster was killed and reduced to dust. Edgar and the rescued students watched Sylviana's victory with wide eyes. She is proud of this and confidently announces that this is enough. Many small stones appeared around them. Not a single monster remained. Sylviana stood in the middle of the cave. The students shouted that the battle was incredible. The monsters were destroyed in the blink of an eye. They were proud of Sylviana. The girl said that monsters turn into magic stones after death. She added that she understood that the students wanted to get better stones. She immediately raised her voice and declared that if they were adventurers, they should soberly assess their strengths. Sylvie was still indignant at the recklessness of the newcomers. She summoned the water spirit Aqua and asked for healing. She ordered her students to retake the training, and if it was difficult for them, they could rely on her. The students looked at her with frightened eyes. One of the students asked in surprise, "Is Sylviana really that S-rank adventurer?" They opened their mouths and immediately began to praise the girl for her achievements and skills. At that moment, Edgar stood there and realized that Sylvie wasn't lying after all, and he no longer had any doubts. They left the dungeon and returned to the square in the village. Mrs. Han warmly thanked Sylviana for saving her students, including her son. The four novice adventurers stood in a row, with the guild master, Sylviana, and Edgar standing in front of them. The master began to reprimand the boys for their misdemeanor. He asked indignantly what they had been taught in training, and whether they realized what would have happened if it weren't for Sylvie. The young men looked tired and dejected, their heads bowed in guilt. They felt their guilt. Sylviana decided to calm the guild master down and said that the students themselves were remorseful. She asked if they understood that they had almost been eaten alive and turned into pieces of meat. The girl asked the students not to put themselves in danger like that again. She added that when they retake the training, she will go with them next time, but she will be very strict. The guild master asked if the girl was sure of her words, but Sylviana calmly replied that this would only happen if she was not busy. After all, her main job now was the farm. Edgar stood next to her and said in surprise that she was unexpectedly very caring. The girl replied that she had a bad habit of taking on too much. A little louder, so that everyone else could hear, she added that this was now her city too. And naturally, she wanted to protect it. Suddenly, Sylvie cheerfully raised her hands with a smile and said that she was very hungry. She and the prince went back to the local shop. Edgar and Sylvie sat across from each other at the table. The prince ordered them each a serving of pancakes with berries. Sylvie asked why pancakes. The prince replied with some dissatisfaction that it was in response to the hot dog they had eaten that day. He couldn't let her outdo him. On the table in front of them was a small teapot, 2 cups, napkins, and cutlery. Sylviana agreed and approved of his actions, since he insisted. Edgar tried the pancakes, and his eyes immediately lit up. He said they were very tasty and juicy. The pancakes were indeed wonderful. Sylvie remarked aloud that Edgar was becoming very sincere about food. The prince, happily eating pancakes, told her that the battle in the dungeon was magnificent. The girl thanked him. Edgar added with a laugh that with such power, not only a coup d'etat was possible, but suddenly he asked if Sylviana had thought of killing his brother Christopher for causing her so much pain. The girl choked on her food, not expecting such a question. She shouted that of course not, and that she was not so primitive as to kill everyone she hated. Edgar was surprised that she hated Christopher, and the girl confirmed it. How could it be otherwise? She says that as far as the prince is concerned, he was the one who started hating her first. It's all very complicated. Edgar listened attentively. Sylviana continued that she had treated Christopher with respect as her fiancé until he became infatuated with Katia and neglected his public duties. Even so, if she started hurting those she disliked, she would cease to be human. Sadness appeared in her eyes. But Sylvie immediately added that she had no intention of losing her humanity just yet. She held a cup of tea in her hands and behaved calmly. Edgar did not understand her words. He said that she was indeed an incomprehensible person, but he would continue to observe her for a while. Sylviana replied sarcastically that princes apparently had nothing better to do. But Edgar continued talking and said that they had agreed that he was a novice adventurer. He asked her to call him by his first name. The prince explained that formalities were unnecessary and that he could also call the girl simply Sylvie. He asked if she agreed. Sylvie looked at him in surprise and wanted to object. But the prince continued and said that she had already switched to that tone somewhere in the middle of the conversation. Sylviana realized that Edgar had noticed this. She said that Edgar just sounded too simple. She laughed at herself and her words. But the prince asked her a little more sternly not to take liberties. Some time later, Sylviana screamed sharply. Edgar ran to her again and asked what had happened. The girl reported that the potato field had been destroyed. The planted crops were in poor condition. The prince arrived and asked again what had happened. Sylvie pointed to the field and said fearfully that a terrible thing had happened. All the seed potatoes that she had planted with such difficulty had been dug up. The girl is firmly convinced that this is the work of horned rabbits. Fury appeared in her eyes. A horned rabbit is a rabbit-like monster, the natural enemy of farmers, ravaging the fields. Sylviana will not forgive the rabbits, because only half a month has passed since sowing. She firmly decided that she wanted potatoes with butter, then French fries, fried potatoes with bacon and black pepper, potato casserole with salmon, and more. The girl was very angry at the pests and did not hide her rage. She clenched her teeth and clenched her fists. She turned to the rabbits and shouted that she would make stew out of all of them. Sylvie called Ignis for help and ordered him to find the culprit. Ignis replied that he would punish the stupid animals that had desecrated the paradise of his beloved lady, meaning Sylviana. But the girl did not approve of his self-confidence and asked the spirit to act without going too far. She called Ventus and asked her to go with Ignis so that he would not get out of control. Ventus replied that they would take the pests alive. Sylviana gave the command to move forward, and the spirits flew off to search for the horned rabbits. Edgar noticed that the spirit's behavior had changed slightly and reported this to Sylvie. The girl replied that this was indeed the case, and that it was strange. She turned to Edgar and asked for his help if he was free. The prince stood next to her and was not very pleased. He wanted to object, but Sylviana interrupted him. She did not consider the prince's surveillance to be important and said that it looked as if the prince was simply shirking his official duties. Edgar wanted to object again, but Sylviana continued and said that she would consider the prince's help as compensation for the moral damage caused by his brother breaking off the engagement. The girl said this in a very confident and important voice. Edgar didn't like Sylviana's confidence, but he didn't argue with her anymore. He asked what he should do then. Sylviana picked up a round roll of shiny wire and asked Edgar to channel his lightning magic through it. She knew that the prince had the attribute of lightning. Edgar took the wire and realized that the girl wanted to protect herself from pests with an electric fence. But then Edgar's expression changed. Anger appeared on his face, and he shouted that the wire was made of mithril. Sylviana replied that mithril enhances magical power and is ideal for this purpose. But Edgar sternly stated that mithril is an extremely valuable metal and should not be used to make wire for some garden fence. The girl replied in a quiet, sad voice that she only had a spare skein left at home and was using it. But the prince immediately shouted that ordinary homes did not have spare mithril. If she tied such a valuable item to the fence, it would be like announcing her wealth to everyone. And even if she managed to protect herself from animals, she could attract thieves. Edgar's face was indignant. He asked Sylviana to be more vigilant because she was a young lady living alone. The girl was shocked. The prince asked for some ordinary wire to be brought. Sylvie did not argue with him and gave in. She turned around and went to get the wire. The girl wondered, was Edgar really not sure that she could handle robbers? In Sylviana's opinion, his surveillance was no longer just observation of her territory. She was surprised and suddenly realized that Edgar was worried about her. Sylvie turned abruptly and looked at him from a distance. The prince was busy dismantling the fence and boards. The girl noticed that he was very serious but good-natured. Sadness appeared in her eyes, and Sylvie shed a tear and lowered her head sadly. If Edgar was coming out of concern, then he should not be considered a nuisance. The girl wondered if it was normal for the prince to fuss over her. Her parents had come to visit her yesterday. Sylvie recalls her father's words yesterday that there still seems to be turmoil in the royal palace. Now, even they've been called upon to help with state affairs. The situation is becoming more complicated. Sylviana's father thinks that the palace is discussing what punishment to impose on His Highness Christopher. According to the girl's father, His Highness Edgar is also busy. He is out during the day and buried in paperwork at night. Sylviana listened to all this yesterday and did not realize the seriousness of the situation. But today, she remembers it and realizes it. If Edgar comes to her between trips, when does he rest? Sylvie noticed a similarity with herself in her past life. Back then, her dream was to open a cafe in an old house with her sister. Her sister would be in charge of cooking, and Sylviana would bake sweets. The girl dreamed of arranging handmade trinkets and selling local vegetables. She had so many things she wanted to do. Working at a regular company to earn capital, Sylviana attended pastry school in the evenings and worked hard for her dream. It all ended so suddenly. According to Sylvie, she thinks a lot, but the girl only came to her senses when she stopped thinking about anything because of her daily busy schedule. Suddenly, the girl ran off in an unknown direction. Edgar was dismantling the fence and saw this. He was curious to know where she had run off to so quickly. Suddenly, Horned rabbits began to run and attack Edgar. Spirits flew along with them. The pests rushed at the prince at great speed. He saw them and screamed loudly, frightened. He began waving his arms and shouting for the spirits not to bring these pests here. But Ventus and Ignis started arguing again. Ignis wanted to burn the monsters to the ground, but Ventus reminded him that Silviana wanted to capture the rabbits alive. Edgar remembered Sylvie's words about how hard it was for her to plant the potatoes that had been so mercilessly destroyed by the horned rabbits. He stood by the fence. Last time, Edgar could only watch the fight and do nothing. But suddenly he jumped into the air. He said that even though he was far from S rank, he was a novice adventurer. The prince held a magic sword in his hands, his eyes filled with confidence and fury, without a trace of fear. Using the sword, he cut the horned rabbit in half. The man allowed the monsters to attack him because he had a weapon and was confident that he could defend this field. His eyes were burning. The horned rabbits jumped furiously and attacked the prince. But he didn't care. The fierce battle continued. Only then did Silviana hear the noise and ask what had happened. Edgar turned around and called out to the girl. He had managed to defeat all the monsters. Sylvie approached him. The prince was standing next to a huge pile of dead rabbits. The girl was very surprised and asked where so many rabbits had come from. She picked one up and saw marks from a magical sword on it. She asked the prince if he had defeated all the monsters. Edgar stood and watched the girl's reaction. At the same time, the spirits were flying nearby and continuing to argue. Ignis complained that Ventus was getting in his way, but Ventus just called him pathetic. Edgar cheerfully reminded Silviana that she wanted to make stew out of these dead rabbits. After all, if you defeat monsters outside the dungeon, they don't turn into magic stones. Sylvie cheerfully praised the man, saying that it turned out great, and called Edgar cool. The pile of rabbits was so huge that the girl thought it would be impossible to eat them all. She planned to grind the horns into ingredients for potions. Sylvie waved her arms, very happy. She was proud that now no one would dare to approach her house. She thanked Edgar again for his help. The man stood there satisfied, a smile on his face. He asked Silviana about the wire because she was supposed to bring it for the fence. Sylvie remembered, but first she announced a short break. She brought a basket with containers of food in it. Edgar asked if Silviana had prepared all this food for him herself. The girl replied that it was enough for two and that she needed a taster. She laid a small blanket on the ground so they could sit on it. Silviana said it was important to eat well and rest. But she turned to the prince and added that he could go back to the palace and eat there. The girl was a little sad, as if she felt guilty towards him. Edgar stood nearby and said he would eat here with her. The containers held juicy, delicious sandwiches, and there was a thermos and cups nearby. Silviana and Edgar sat in the middle of the courtyard, not far from the entrance to the house. The sunlight illuminated everything around them with bright rays. The prince praised the girl's food and said it was very tasty. Sylvie was glad that he liked it. She thought lunch in the garden was just wonderful. There was a very friendly atmosphere between them. Suddenly, the girl turned to Edgar. He was slowly drinking his tea. Silviana suddenly offered the prince a job at her house. Edgar nearly choked on his tea and asked her to repeat herself. The girl explained that he had decided to conduct surveillance, and she would not stop him. But she was very concerned that Edgar wasn't getting enough sleep and would collapse from exhaustion. The prince offered her another idea, that she take care of things in his workshop and work with his documents at the same time. Silviana didn't understand what he was talking about. She suddenly picked up a small rectangular bag and gave it to Edgar as a gift. It was a Nandemo Hale, an item that could hold as many things as you wanted thanks to the magic imbued in it. It was a convenient item that showed the desperation of the game developers. Edgar was surprised by Silviana's gift. He asked her not to talk about the Nandemo Hale so casually because it was a high-end item. The prince said that such an item was created by rare masters of spatial magic, combining magic stones. Silviana calmly and kindly told him that if he put all his documents in this bag, it would be easier to move around. Edgar agreed with her, but did not want to accept it because it was a very expensive item. But the girl raised her index finger and sternly declared that in return, the prince would have to help her on the farm. Then they would be even. She exclaimed joyfully and invited Edgar into her peaceful life. At first, the prince's face was serious and surprised. But then he suddenly laughed. Silviana did not understand his reaction. He explained that the girl was so out of the ordinary that he found it funny. Sylvie suggested that he get used to it. The man covered his mouth with his hand and laughed quietly. It recently became clear that Prince Christopher was enchanted by charm. It was very sad. Christopher sat on the bed, dejected, with his head down, looking like a mentally ill person. His bed was lit by the sun's rays. Because Christopher was enchanted, he couldn't notice Silviana's existence, and she possessed far more charm than any spell. Sylvie was at home. She stood at the table and painstakingly sculpted decorations, slowly, carefully putting her soul into it. The bright sun shone through the window opposite her. The girl was very focused. There were many flasks, bubbles, and trays on the table. The girl mixed silver clay with fragments of a magic stone and shaped it. She held a very small piece of clay in her hands. With a small, thin stick, she shaped this piece into a rose. A little bit of delicate work, just a little bit of magical power. It was done. Sylvie happily announced that the earrings with charms that make the wearer a little bit prettier were ready. She gave the earrings magical power with her hands. The result was very small, but neatly made earrings. One of the points in Sylviana's plan for a peaceful life was to create and sell jewelry. She says that she finally has time to do this. The girl admired the earrings she had created. She went to the shop and took her jewelry to sell to other people. The shop owner, a young man, saw Sylvie and immediately exclaimed happily that her jewelry was so popular that it would sell out right away. Sylvie laughed in response and playfully said how difficult it was for her to be a popular designer. She believes that any girl who wears these earrings will feel more confident. But Sylvie didn't want to dwell too much on her dreams and thoughts. She says that whether in her past life or this one, she has no luck in love, but these failures do not kill the romantic nature inside her. The girl even finds it awkward, but then she suddenly remembered Edgar. She wondered if the prince would come today or not. After all, he was working here yesterday. Sylviana sat at the table where she made earrings, looking very pensive. Although Edgar and Christopher are brothers, Edgar is not at all like his brother. He is serious, with a keen sense of justice. Sylviana thinks that at first Edgar was nitpicky and caused her trouble, but lately he has become much softer. Maybe it's thanks to her? At that moment, the girl remembered how she had recently treated him to delicious sandwiches in the garden. She wonders what Edgar and she are to each other now. Relatives, perhaps? Sylvie explains that the royal family and the ducal house are distant relatives. Sylviana and Edgar have known each other for a long time, so perhaps they are considered childhood friends. But they only really started talking after the engagement was broken off. The girl thinks that it is unexpectedly easy to communicate with him. Maybe they're friends? In her opinion, apart from her adventurous acquaintances, Edgar is probably the first man with whom she can chat so easily. The girl wonders what the prince himself thinks about this. She was pensive, even a little sad. But suddenly, there was a neat knock on the door. Sylviana immediately thought of Edgar and called out to him. The man stood in the doorway, very serious, pensive, slightly lost. Sylvie pointed out to him that he had come late today. The prince confirmed and agreed. The girl was worried that her words sounded strange, as if she had been waiting for him. But Edgar sadly lowered his head and told Sylvie that he wanted to ask her forgiveness. He told her that Christopher was under a charm curse. The girl was surprised and shocked. Edgar continued and said that, in fact, traces of the curse had been found throughout the castle. Sylviana did not understand what he was talking about, what curse he was referring to, and who could have done it. The prince said that the spellcaster who had unknowingly enchanted those around her was Lady Katia. Sylviana froze and was even more shocked by Edgar's words. He continued and said that the investigation report had arrived the previous evening. The prince himself was in shock when he learned the news about his brother's curse yesterday. He, Christopher, and the king sat in the castle and tried to find a solution to the problem. The king declared that it was all true and that Katia's influence had spread to them as well. Christopher sat on the sofa, looking dejected and pained, without saying a word. Edgar scolded him. He was outraged that Katia and Christopher had gone into the dungeon without permission and caught the curse there. And Katia was a commoner to boot. The king told them they had to continue the investigation. But, according to the king, this is what happened. Christopher and Lady Katia entered the unexplored ruins with guards for training. There, the lady seemed to have been subjected to an ancient curse of demons. As a result, she unwittingly began to spread charm around her. Christopher, who was nearby, was most strongly affected. Lady Katia is now being purified in the temple. Edgar, who heard this version from the king, was shocked. But the king continued, saying that, moreover, the influence of the curse had spread to the entire castle. Members of the royal family and servants began to feel sympathy for Lady Katia. Therefore, anything that caused her discomfort had to be eliminated. The king said that this was exactly how they had acted. He himself did not understand why he had no doubts. And the fact that the king so easily accepted the proposal to break off the engagement with Melchiorine was all because of this. Edgar was stunned. The prince had also been strangely agitated at the time. Edgar's fierce desire to expel Sylvie from his domain was due to the curse. The prince wondered why he hadn't noticed it. He sat in his chair with a pensive, sad look on his face. Edgar looked at his brother. Christopher had never had such a gloomy look on his face before. Indeed, he looked very exhausted. Edgar believes that Christopher whom he knows, has always been the most serious and hardworking of them all. As children, the brothers loved each other and wanted to defend their country together in the future. Christopher knew how to find talent in people and develop it. He was the first to recognize Edgar's abilities in fencing and magic, and even worked with him to create training programs. Therefore, Edgar considered it natural that Christopher discovered the power of the commoner Katia and made frequent visits to the academy for her sake. He did not think that romantic feelings were involved in any way. Prince Edgar regrets that he did not pay attention to this whole situation earlier. Christopher continued to sit in front of him with a dejected look on his face. But suddenly he clenched his fists. He stood up and shouted with great fury that it was all Silviana Melcarini's fault. His eyes filled with anger and hatred. Christopher said that he and Katia had proceeded cautiously, taking A-rank adventurers with them, and had fallen under the curse only because of bad luck. The king and Edgar were shocked and frightened by such harsh statements. Christopher did not stop and shouted that it was for to prove Katia's abilities to the royal family. Edgar asked his brother to calm down. They stood facing each other, and Prince Edgar began to speak in a calmer tone. If he wanted to enter the dungeon as an adventurer, he needed to soberly assess his strengths. The man remembered Sylvie's words. But Christopher did not want to listen to his brother and grabbed him roughly by the collar. He shouted and asked Edgar what he knew about adventuring. Christopher's gaze was filled with intense hatred. He literally looked like a monster. Edgar tried to control himself. The king ordered Christopher to stop. He said that the prince would soon be sentenced, and in the meantime, he should continue to purify himself from the curse. Christopher let go of Edgar and moved away from him. The king sat on the sofa completely calmly, maintaining his wisdom. The influence of the curse on the king and Edgar had already disappeared, but the king still asked the prince to undergo purification in the temple as well. Edgar agreed and did not resist. Christopher turned away and did not speak to them. Yesterday, it was very painful for Edgar to look at his brother. He told Silviana all about it today and explained everything. The prince and the girl sat at the table in a very sad atmosphere. Sylvie could not fully comprehend the situation with the curse, Katia, and Christopher. Bitter tears welled up in her eyes. The prince sat in front of her, bent over with regret and pain. He sincerely apologized to the girl for what had happened. Edgar explained that although it was the influence of the curse, he considered Silviana an enemy and attacked her with accusations. She listened to this and cried, lowering her head. The girl decided to make sure that the curse no longer had any effect on Edgar. He confirmed this and said that he had undergone complete purification in the temple. Suddenly, Sylvie cheerfully declared that everything was fine then. The prince did not understand her reaction and was a little surprised. The girl explained that at the palace, Edgar had seemed strange to her. But when Christopher attacked, he rushed to defend her. And then, when he burst into her farmhouse, he apologized profusely and was very upset. The girl said that now that she understood the reason for all this strange behavior, she felt even better. Her tears dried up and were replaced by laughter. She hoped that Edgar now understood that surveillance was unnecessary. The prince sat quietly. He agreed with Sylvie and added that there was no one more reliable than her. The girl smiled at this. Edgar said that his stupidity, which had prevented him from questioning his brother's actions, was also his responsibility. Silviana wanted to convince him that everything was fine. She said that Christopher himself was responsible for his actions. He should have understood that in the future he would have to support the country and control many things. Edgar hung his head guiltily. Silviana continued, saying that Christopher had been carried away by Katia, gone into a dangerous dungeon, and fallen under a curse. Sylvie believed that he got what he deserved. She said this in a slightly angry tone, feeling justified. Edgar said that these words sounded more convincing coming from her. The girl was pleased by this. The prince sat and recalled moments from his childhood with his brother and said that everything was very complicated. Silviana sadly began to say that there was a time when she also did everything she could. But in the end, if Prince Christopher wanted to be with the commoner Katia instead of her, he would have to overcome many obstacles. He would have to make an effort or give up his status as a member of the royal family and run away with Katia. In any case, according to Silviana, it was a thorny path. If only she could convey this to His Highness Christopher. But Sylvie declared that she had been reborn as a villain and knew that the breakup of the engagement was inevitable. These words sounded very sad. But could she really? Silviana and Christopher didn't even look at each other at the party, canceling tea time. Sylvie cried out that, after all, the prince was to blame. Weakness of character cannot be easily corrected. But suddenly the girl noticed that the weather was very nice today. And suddenly she suggested that Edgar make hamburgers. She got up from the table and became very cheerful and energetic. The prince did not expect such a proposal, but he also got up after Sylvie. She happily asked him to help her prepare an unhealthy meal full of fat and calories. They went to the kitchen together. Edgar did not understand the girl's logic, but replied that today he would do anything. The young people began cooking. Edgar chopped vegetables, while Sylviana kneaded the minced meat for the patties with her hands. In front of them lay a large bag of flour and cooking utensils. A few minutes later, the prince said that charm was very powerful magic after all. He asked Sylvie if she had thought of using this magic on Christopher too. The girl stood nearby and replied that why would she use charm if she and Christopher couldn't stand each other? Besides, Sylvie didn't want to manipulate anyone, and she didn't want to interfere with someone else's love. At that moment, she continued to knead the minced meat, while Edgar stood nearby. The girl said that if she ever fell in love with someone, she wanted to achieve everything on her own. A little help from jewelry would be enough for her. She looked very kind and sweet. Edgar noticed this. He said that it turned out the girl could make such a face. Sylviana did not understand what he was talking about. He replied that she had a romantic face. There was a truly romantic atmosphere between them. But Sylviana immediately destroyed the romance. She ordered the prince to stop talking nonsense and get back to cooking. In the end, they made large hamburgers with juicy patties and rustic fried potatoes as a side dish. The hamburgers were accompanied by a refreshing drink with ice. An unknown middle-aged man, named Dryden, is sitting in front of a box of jewelry. He says in a languid voice that even fake jewelry made of magic stones fetches a good price. In his hand is a pendant made of a large, beautiful stone, framed by expensive patterned metal on a chain. Another man stands in front of Dryden, a short old man in work clothes. He thanks Mr. Dryden and says he's counting on him in the future, for the sake of their common cause. Meanwhile, Sylviana and Edgar are happily strolling through the city. They walk past beautiful shop windows, along the tiled sidewalk past streetlights. They chat casually, looking at the sights and shop signs. Sylvie says she is glad that she can finally sell the accessories. The jewelry was in her bottomless bag, which hung on her shoulder. Edgar saw it and asked if it was the amulet the girl had made last time. An amulet is a magical item imbued with effects such as charm or protection. The girl pointed to her hair clip and jewelry as examples. Edgar listened to her calmly and attentively. She said that such jewelry was very difficult to obtain. The prince replied that he thought Sylvie would always be able to earn a living, no matter what job she did. They continued to chat casually and arrived at the store. The salesman greeted them. He said that Sylvie had come just in time. Two women were standing in front of the display case next to the salesman. Sylviana recognized one of them, with light hair, and asked what had happened to her. The woman approached Sylviana and asked her to look at her hands. She handed her several pieces of jewelry, butterfly-shaped earrings and round earrings with stones. Sylvie was surprised and said that the woman's work was terrible. The silver was roughly crafted, the engraving was asymmetrical, and it was definitely not Sylviana's work. The woman began to explain that these earrings were advertised as earrings with the magic of charm, and she bought them thinking they were Sylvie's work. When this woman wore Sylvie's earrings, she would receive tips, but with this pair of earrings, nothing worked out. She was very upset. She came to the store for advice, thinking they were fake. Sylviana did not expect to see a fake. The design was clearly copied. Edgar looked at the jewelry and pointed out that the earrings did indeed look like the original. Sylviana didn't understand how it looked like the original at all. She took in her hands to look at it more closely and started shouting that she couldn't stand being put on a par with such cheap goods. The girl puts magic into each piece with special care, and she only supplies goods to this store, so this is definitely a fake. She was furious. The salesperson told her that her products were indeed high quality, but the price was also high. The aggrieved woman agreed and said that these earrings were cheap, so she bought them right away. Sylviana asked angrily, what did it matter that they were cheap? But she immediately tried to calm down and control herself. She thought that no, the buyer was not to blame, it was something else entirely. She looked at the earrings and said that with such magic, the charm would not work. Moreover, there was a risk of explosion due to the inept spell. The others were frightened. Suddenly, Sylviana clenched the earrings in her fist and shouted that he would get what he deserved. She would not forgive such a malicious forgery. Inside, Sylviana was boiling with rage. Not only had he insulted her work, but he was also deceiving people and putting them in danger. This was someone unknown. The girl's eyes filled with hatred. Edgar didn't understand what was going on and wanted to stop her. Sylvie viciously declared that she would break into the store and punish him herself. Suddenly, she started to leave in a fit of rage. Edgar began to ask her to calm down. She said she was calm. The prince stopped her by the shoulder, and the girl turned around. They looked into each other's eyes. At that moment, the girl really calmed down and stopped. She thanked Edgar and assured him that she was fine. The woman apologized and said that she was to blame for the situation. Her friend confidently said that they would throw away this awful junk. Sylviana agreed and replied that they should do so. That would be the right thing to do. She approached the sales manager and gave him her products to sell. He accepted them. He said that many people wanted to buy her products. He assured her that he had no problems with Sylvie and that he would personally take responsibility for selling every item. The women stood nearby and rejoiced that fate had led them to buy high-quality, authentic jewelry from Sylviana today. Edgar looked at the girl and was proud of her. Sylvie thanked everyone for their trust in her products, and she and the prince left the store. Edgar asked if the appearance of imitations was not a common occurrence. He thought that Sylvie, as the designer, would probably find it unpleasant and offensive to see this. The girl agreed. She said that she lost her temper at that moment. For a moment, she felt as if she was being consumed by anger. Is this the essence of the final boss? Sylvie was upset, a little tense, and concerned about what had happened in the store. She clenched her fists. She said she couldn't leave things like this, and that it was no longer just a problem. Edgar tensed at her words. Sylviana said that this time it was just an accessory, but what if it had been an amulet for adventurers? The fake could have exploded in the dungeon, injuring someone, or perhaps even leading to the death of the entire group. Sylviana was frightened, and she asked Edgar for help. The girl declared loudly that she would find the criminal and destroy him. She was very confident in her actions. Edgar tensed up and remained silent. Sylvie continued, saying that the unknown person had endangered not only her, but also the people who trusted her, and that such a thing could not be forgiven. Edgar noticed that the girl was still furious. They came up with the idea of going to the guild, and they headed there. They arrived. The guild master greeted the young people and asked Sylvie if she had come about the amulet. He was holding rolled-up papers and folders in his hands. The girl replied that, as expected, he already knew everything. The guild master began to tell them that a buyer had approached him. The Association of Adventurers had already begun an investigation. Sylviana and Edgar sat down on the sofa in the guild room. The master turned to Sylvie and said that, judging by her appearance, she was going to catch the criminal. But he added that this time the opponent was not easy. Only one company could purchase such materials for counterfeiting. He wanted to finish his thought, but Sylviana finished it for him. She said that only the Dryden Trading Company could do that. She sat there with an indignant and angry look on her face. Edgar asked if Dryden was a wholesaler operating in their region. The master replied that yes, he was officially operating. Dryden Matheson, known for his extensive dirty business. Rumor has it that Dryden is involved in almost all fraud and robbery in the area. The real Grey Cardinal of the city of Erdei. The guild master said that they would also like to deal with Dryden's organization, but they only managed to catch the pawns. Edgar said that it seems like every city has its own villain. Sylviana disapprovingly compared Dryden to a Yakuza boss. The prince was surprised by these words. It was a term from Sylvie's past life. She says that this time Dryden most likely forced some poor craftsmen to make counterfeits and sold them to unsuspecting stores. Dryden will surely cut and run before things get serious. The girl thinks that if they're going to catch him, they need to go after the top dog. Otherwise, there's no point. Sylvie looked very thoughtful. She said that if that was the case, she would submit a request to the guild. The content of the request: please find a craftsman who is making counterfeits. Her words sounded confident. The guild master asked if she wanted to submit the request herself and carry it out herself. Sylviana replied that yes. Even if she was looking for a criminal, she had to follow the formalities. Edgar said that then, as they had discussed, they would only be able to catch the pawns. After all, they had no evidence of Dryden's involvement. Sylviana lowered her head sadly and replied that she could just break into his place and beat him up. Edgar sternly ordered her not to even joke about such a thing. Sylvie declared that if she accepted the request and investigated the case of the master forger, she would definitely get to Dryden. Her eyes showed indignation and determination, and at the same time, she would receive a reward for crimes related to him, which would be many times greater than the payment for the order. Edgar was surprised by the girl's enthusiasm. The guild master said that she could not be stopped now. He added that the guild would also gather information about the manufacturer. They would contact Sylviana within a few days. The girl thanked the master for his help with the investigation. Sylvie and Edgar left the guild and headed to a shop for a bite to eat. The girl ordered a seasonal lemon cake for them and wished the prince bon appetit. It seemed that the prince was not very happy with the cake, but Sylviana was delighted because she really wanted lemon cake. She said happily that it was so good that there were different seasons. The young people sat down at the table again and enjoyed their meal. Other women in the shop saw Edgar and gossiped about him. They were curious about who this handsome man was. All they knew was that he was some kind of newcomer and adventurer. Edgar told Sylviana that this town seemed very quiet and peaceful, but in reality, it turned out that there were villains here too. The girl replied that villains love secluded towns. Dryden was cunning, so the royal family probably didn't even consider him a problem. If a major crime that the guild cannot handle comes to light, the state will respond. But Dryden skillfully stays in the shadows. Edgar replied that if that was the case, then selling counterfeits this time was his mistake. He had gone where he shouldn't have. Edgar's face was calm, but determined. Sylviana confirmed this and cheerfully agreed with him. The prince said that he was counting on Sylvie and that he would also try to find out something through his family. The girl approved, rejoiced, and said it was excellent. But suddenly she slumped, lowered her eyes, and fell into thought. The prince looked at her kindly and ate his pie. Sylviana turned to him. She said that he had saved her today when she had almost lost control. She felt that she had become angrier than she thought she would be because of the neglect of her work. It was even frightening. Sylviana folded her hands on her knees in fear. She continued and said that if she started to lose control again, the girl did not have time to finish, and Edgar interrupted her. The man immediately assured her that everything would be fine and that he would be able to calm her down before anything happened. He was very kind and gentle. In Sylviana's eyes, he became even better. The prince jokingly added that if the girl lost control, there would be nothing he could do, and he laughed at his own words. Sylvie smiled and said that yes, it was possible. She said that until now, she had turned a blind eye to Dryden's antics. But now it was time to teach him a lesson. Sylviana declared resolutely that she would make Dryden regret crossing her path. The girl's gaze was filled with the same hatred as before. To be continued, Edgar and Sylviana were walking down a very suspicious alley. Tall panel buildings stood around them. This place was unlike the other alleys and streets of the city. The young people approached an unfamiliar store with a closed door. They asked about Mr. Jyland's shop. The door was opened by a middle-aged man with wrinkles, very small and thin. He looked very tired, did not seem friendly, and looked suspicious. The man asked who was bothering him. Sylviana introduced herself in a friendly manner and said that they were adventurers who had formed a group. Edgar stood next to her, slightly dissatisfied with this man in the shop. Sylvie continued and said that they had come on the recommendation of a friend and would like to ask Mr. Jyland to make amulets for them. At first, the man did not understand what recommendation Sylvie was talking about. But soon he unexpectedly and happily replied that it was very nice and that he would fulfill any whim for their money. He invited them inside to discuss the details. Sylviana and Edgar went in, but they still didn't trust this man. Jyland is a craftsman of magical instruments. He was recommended to them by the guild master. According to the master, it was Jyland who was creating the fakes. There was no doubt about it. The master quickly found this information and provided it to Sylviana. Jyland used to work as a craftsman of magical instruments. But recently, he suddenly became rich. Surveillance spotted Jyland leaving Dryden's mansion. Sylviana told the guild master that they would take care of the rest themselves, and that through Jyland, the guys would catch the scoundrel Dryden red-handed. Edgar was very tense at the time. Sylvie added that this would be the first assignment for the newcomer, referring to the prince. She was counting on him, and so Sylviana and Edgar entered Mr. Jyland's shop. He apologized to his guests for the slight mess. His workshop was filled with shelves covered with tools, vases, jars, and various other items. Papers hung on the walls, and there were rags and bags in the boxes. Boards lay scattered on the floor, and an old ladder stood nearby. Jyland's workshop gave off a strange feeling. Sylviana immediately thought that the man was hiding fakes here because his home and workshop were combined. They carefully examined the place. Mr. Jyland asked what kind of amulet Sylvie and Edgar wanted. The girl remained polite and replied that, in fact, they had already picked one out. It was an amulet filled with magic, with the approval of an S-rank adventurer, which everyone was talking about. She asked if he was the one who made it. Jyland listened very superficially with a dissatisfied expression on his face. Sylviana asked him to make her an amulet filled with magic, which was sold on Grunner Street. It was the same fake amulet that the woman had bought at a low price in the store, thinking that Sylviana had made it. Mr. Jyland pretended not to understand the request. He replied that he did indeed make amulets, but had never said that they were approved by an S-rank adventurer. Jyland asked them if they had confused something. There was a cunning look in his eyes, and he looked like a swindler. But Sylviana and Edgar were not so easily fooled. The prince sternly declared that denial was useless, and he already had his adventurer's magic sword at the ready. Jyland tensed up a little and was surprised by the prince's words. Edgar said that they had already conducted an investigation and turned to Jyland, saying that he was the one creating the fakes. Jyland sat down wearily on a stool nearby, pretending he was not guilty. Edgar asked Mr. Jyland not to resist and to follow them to the guild. Suddenly, Jylan jumped up from his stool and yelled at the guests. Edgar was very unhappy, but Sylviana was ready to fight. Jylan wanted to attack the girl and hit her, but she blocked his path with her foot. He stumbled and fell to the floor. He didn't have enough strength to resist two people. Edgar pushed him harder onto the floor and grabbed his arms from behind. Jylan screamed and resisted, calling Edgar a scoundrel and demanding to be released. But Edgar did not give up, and Jylan was captured and tied up. Sylviana stood nearby and praised the prince for his feat, patting him on the back. The prince was immediately delighted by the girl's words. He said that she could have tied up the craftsman herself, but left it to him. Sylvie explained that she had come today in her favorite summer dress and didn't want to get it dirty. Meanwhile, Jylan tried to free himself from the ropes and began shouting, asking who they were. Edgar prevented the man from escaping and tied him up even tighter. The prince replied that they were adventurers, but not ordinary ones. Sylviana added with a smile that she was looking for the person who had ordered the counterfeits. She asked who had hired him. The man did not want to confess. Sylvie was deliberately very nice to him and said that if he told her everything honestly, she might even let him go. Jylan shouted with hatred and anger that he would not tell anything to a little girl like Sylvie. She kindly said that it was very rude of him. The girl turned to Jylan and said that there was nothing she could do. She would have to make him talk. She asked Edgar to stand behind her. Edgar didn't know about his partner's plans and asked what she was up to. Sylviana's face was very confident. Suddenly, the girl began to use her magic. Jylan was still lying on the floor and was furious. Sylviana began to use her intimidation skill, which she had used in the dungeon. Edgar was not expecting this and was even a little scared. He thought that there had been many monsters back then, but now there was only Jylan, and the pressure on a single target was probably unimaginable. The swindler tried to find out who she was, and then he guessed. She was an S-rank adventurer. The man realized this with horror, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead from fear. Meanwhile, the intimidation skill was working at full force. Sylviana proudly and directly ordered Jylan to tell the truth while he still had the chance. The man cried out loudly and painfully that Dryden was to blame for everything. He began to explain that he had agreed to work with Dryden for money, otherwise he would have been hounded out of town. Edgar and Sylviana listened to the swindler's words, but they already knew the truth. The girl asked if he had any proof of his words. Jylan replied that there was no proof, and if anyone found out that he had broken his silence, it would be the end of him. He screamed and begged to be let go. Sylvie approached him and took him by the shoulders. In a sweet voice, the girl began to say that she wanted to catch Dryden, not him. She convinced the swindler that if she succeeded, he too would be able to live in peace. And she asked why he shouldn't go along with her. Jylan asked in a pitiful voice if Sylviana really wouldn't arrest him. The girl promised not to arrest him. The man thought for a moment. He said that Dryden was selling monsters in the basement of his mansion. Edgar and Sylviana listened attentively with indignation. The prince was surprised by what he heard. Sylvie said it was illegal and wanted to know what Dryden was up to. Jylan didn't know about these plans. The girl asked why Dryden needed monsters at all. At that moment, the prince paused to think and began to reason. He suggested that Dryden's monsters might be needed for underground fighting. Sylviana asked if it was for entertainment. The prince replied in the affirmative. He added that this was common practice in the criminal world of the capital city of Venice. Such individuals are usually behind incidents involving the appearance of monsters in the city. The creatures could escape accidentally, or they could be deliberately released into the city to cover up other crimes. Of course, all of this is serious business, violating the law on monster control. Jylan said one thing was certain. There was much more money involved in these cases than in his counterfeiting. Suddenly, Sylviana began to think that all she did was go to the dungeons, so she didn't know about such details. The girl realized that Edgar was praised for a reason. Sylvie remembered and said that during her school days, they sometimes received orders to hunt monsters in the middle of the night. She assumed that this was related to Dryden. But Edgar was angry that Sylviana had run away from the dormitory in the middle of the night, and he was indignant. The girl explained that there was a teleportation circle drawn on the closet in her room. The prince stated that Sylvie had no such records in the Crystal of Time. The girl replied that normal people sleep at night, so there was no need to record everything. During their conversation, Jylan began to shout that he had told everything and demanded to be released. Sylviana momentarily forgot that Jylan was with them. She told Edgar that he could deal with the swindler himself. The prince replied that she could rely on him. He grabbed Jylan by the rope and pulled him toward him, tightening the rope even more. The swindler screamed and moaned in pain, his eyes filled with terror. He shouted that this was not what they had agreed upon. Sylviana asked with a smile what he meant by that. She laughed and replied that she would not arrest him. That was true. But Edgar laughed along with her and said that he had not promised anything like that. Jylan was even more terrified. He called them dirty cheaters. Sylviana replied that this was not true. Edgar continued to hold Jylan and told Sylvie that they needed proof of his actions. The girl began to look for a place where the swindler could hide this evidence. She searched the shelves, racks, and all the junk in the workshop. Suddenly, she came across a safe built into the wall and said that it looked very suspicious. Jylan immediately became frightened and cried out that he would not give them the key. Sylvie immediately realized that if the swindler was saying that, then the evidence was definitely inside. Jylan declared that if the guys broke his safe, he would file a complaint. Edgar replied sarcastically that Jylan was the last person who should be filing complaints. He himself should be reported for his crimes. Sylviana asked again that the main thing was not to break it, right? She saw that the safe was sealed and could only be opened by a registered user. A complex lock mechanism had to be activated in a specific sequence. The girl thought about it and tried to figure it out. But suddenly she said happily that it was the work of Leonard, a locksmith known for his eccentricity. She added that it was a true work of art that was not so easy to open. Jylan complained that it had taken him a lot of effort to get this safe as a share of the proceeds from the magic tool scam. Edgar replied that it seemed Jylan's list of crimes was growing. At that moment, Sylviana was trying to set the lock mechanism in motion. She turned the gears and thin parts. And finally, she opened it. Inside was a jar of gold, various folders and papers, bags, and fake jewelry. Jylan was outraged and angry. Lockpicking is a necessary skill for penetrating ancient ruins. He wondered what kind of adventurer she was. After all, she had said that such locks usually cannot be opened. The girl began to examine the contents of the safe. She found records of transactions with Dryden and fake amulets. Sylviana was delighted that they now had all the evidence they needed. She picked up a fake piece of jewelry and was horrified by the terrible carving, which made her angry at first glance. Edgar asked if Jylan was really the creator of these amulets. The swindler wanted to stop them, but Sylviana interrupted him. She asked Jylan not to worry and said she would never let him make fake jewelry again. The girl clenched the amulets in her fist with malice. The prince said fearfully and thoughtfully that trading monsters was a matter of national importance and needed to be resolved quickly if it was indeed true. Sylviana agreed and said that they had no time for talk. Dryden must be stopped as soon as possible. The Dryden Trading Company is located in the city of Ouji, not far from the turn to the royal capital. In the very center of Ouji is the market, where all the residents go for food and household goods. Several roads lead from a market into the city. On one side is Gruner Street, and on the other is the Great Guild. Between them is a path leading to Mr. Jylan's house and workshop. Among all these places are small village houses where the city's residents live. Sylvie's house is located just past the guild, along a straight road. Sylviana and Edgar arrived at the Dryden mansion. The building looked very majestic, like a magical castle. But at the same time, it was very dark and gloomy, and there was a sense of danger. Sylviana said that this was to be expected from an unscrupulous trading company. Even in this elite neighborhood, the mansion stood out for its size. Edgar was outraged that this company could be trading monsters underground. He believed that this was completely unacceptable. The prince asked Sylviana what their next steps would be. The girl proudly began to explain their plan. They handed Jylan over to the guild and obtained testimony that the fakes were ordered by Dryden. Now, they need to dig up the customer himself. In the process, they will accidentally discover the monster trade and arrest Dryden. Sylviana thought this plan was very smooth and easy, but Edgar had a different opinion. He asked the girl suspiciously why she thought everything would go so smoothly according to plan. Even though they have testimony, it is not a fact that the monsters are in the mansion right now. The prince was a little upset. He said that they need to gather a little more evidence. Sylviana replied that it was a hassle and that the mansion was clearly suspicious anyway. Edgar didn't really agree with her. They walked up to a tall, iron fence. Sylvie turned to Edgar and asked him to focus all his magic in his eyes and take a closer look because it looked like a normal, luxurious mansion. The prince didn't quite understand what she meant, and he was in a bad mood. But the fence was covered with powerful lightning magic, and behind it was a double magical barrier. Edgar was horrified. Sylvie said that with such protection, even a horned rabbit would not stand chance. It would not let enemies in or others out. This was almost an admission that something was hidden here. Edgar said that they shouldn't rush, but Sylviana replied that, on the contrary, they needed to hurry. Because Jylan had been captured, rumors of their actions could reach Dryden. And then, of course, they would increase security. The girl looked indignant, trying to prove her point. She shouted that they had to seize the moment. There was determination in her eyes. Edgar did not resist and understood her. He said it was a bit risky, but they could break in under the pretext of searching the house. Edgar wanted to return to the capital to get the necessary documents and soldiers. But Sylviana said that she would then enter the mansion alone. The prince immediately said that she was not allowed to go down into the dungeon. He asked sternly what the girl would do if she lost control of herself again because of her anger. Sylvie was surprised and a little shocked. Edgar continued and said that the guild had a teleportation circle to the capital and that he would be back in 20 minutes. He ordered the girl to wait for him quietly and began to leave. Sylviana reluctantly obeyed and agreed. She was left alone and began to think about the mansion. It was huge. In this world, the Melcarini family took bribes from dishonest merchants. Sylviana believed that if everything was the same as in the game, then the place must be correct. She thought about Edgar's words and was glad that he had stopped her in her anger. The Duke's daughter and an S-rank adventurer. Of course, she has power, but we must not forget that she is still considered a villain in this world. When Sylviana was little, her parents told her that she was very strong. She wanted to undergo rigorous training and gain strength that surpassed theirs. Her parents asked her not to forget that her strength must be used correctly. They wanted to teach her to listen to her own heart. Sylviana understands everything. The game developers probably created Sylviana as a mean character that you can do anything with. But her parents, who live in this world, clearly didn't want their daughter to become a villain. And she herself doesn't want to become the final boss. Sylvie was sad. Suddenly, the girl heard a noise and rustling nearby. She turned around and saw a tall carriage, but she couldn't see it very well from a distance. The carriage looked like a horse-drawn carriage. Suddenly, the girl saw it, and she realized that there was a monster in this carriage. She thought it was too brazen to deliver goods to the mansion. The monster was sitting inside the carriage in a cage covered with cloth. The guards also gathered at the unloading area. Sylviana thought it was a great moment to attack. She just wanted to see what was going on there and mentally apologized to Edgar. The girl began to envelop her arms and legs in magic to immediately deflect lightning. At the same time, she cast a spell of silence. Sylvie boldly climbed onto the high protective fence and was not afraid of anything. She was very determined. As a result, she wrapped herself in a magical invisibility cloak. An invisibility cloak is a spell that makes the body transparent but tangible. And so, Sylviana found herself on the other side of the fence, in front of the mansion. She carefully entered the tall, front doors of the building. She found herself in a huge room with columns and high ceilings. This room alone resembled an entire palace. It was the first floor where the company's office was located. Sylviana was surprised to see so many people walking around the office. She hid behind the columns and monitored the situation. But she found it strange that she couldn't see the monster that had just been brought in. She assumed that they had a mage responsible for camouflage. Suddenly, Sylviana saw a secret door. It was located next to a row of majestic columns. She approached the door and thought that since this secret door was so carefully hidden by magic, it was clearly not a wine cellar inside. Sylvie waved her hand, and with magic, she was able to break down the door. It was not difficult for her. The door swung open, and the girl went inside. In front of her was a deep and wide staircase leading to the basement. The room was dark with no light. The girl noticed that the room smelled strongly of monsters. Her gaze was as confident as possible, and she began to descend the dark steps, carefully assessing the situation. Monsters are mysterious creatures born in the underground. Since they are kept in the basement, it is unlikely that there are particularly strong monsters there, but some collectors with bad taste forcibly capture them and try to tame them. The stronger the monster, the less likely it is to leave the dungeon on its own. Sylviana realized that she must remain vigilant. She walked down the scary staircase that led down, and she held a magic fan in her hands. She approached another dark, tall door, behind which something very important was hidden. On the count of 3, she waved her fan and abruptly opened the door. The girl saw a huge room and entered it. The entire room was filled with cages in which angry monsters were sitting. They were fighting, very angry, trying to get out. Sylviana was frightened. She imagined what would happen if all the monsters broke out and was horrified. But in one of the cages, the girl saw a baby dragon. Dragons are a type of monster that are highly intelligent and do not attack humans without reason. They are usually distinguished from monsters and treated with respect. Sylviana felt sorry for the baby dragon and wondered how it had been caught. She sat down next to its cage. The baby dragon growled. Sylvie sadly informed her that dragons completely trust people they recognize as friends, and you cannot treat a dragon cruelly. The girl promised the dragon cub that she would defeat the one who caught him. She was very sad. Sylvie put her hand in the dragon's cage. It sniffed her and stopped being angry. The girl thought that it would be bad if the monsters started a riot, and if she attacked first, there would be problems. Suddenly, she called Ventus for help, and ordered him to put all the monsters to sleep with his scent. Ventus did so, and all the monsters instantly fell asleep, as if spellbound. The spirit Ignis appeared and asked if his help was needed here. Sylvie replied that his help was not needed yet, because fire could not be used in such a place. The girl was angry that the spirit of fire had appeared without asking. Suddenly, several male guards appeared at the door and asked who was there. Sylviana realized that they had found her and began to panic. The guards rushed at her, shouting and asking what had happened to the monsters and why they were asleep. They wanted to know who Sylviana was and threatened that she was asking for trouble. But the girl shook off her panic and replied proudly and calmly that they were fools and that the whole problem was their fault. Although, in Sylviana's opinion, petty people like them would never understand that. Her gaze radiated confidence. She declared that it was time to crush them. But the male guards were armed with war bows and arrows. In response, they shouted that Sylvie was talking nonsense and couldn't handle the crowd of guards. They were ordered to finish the girl off. But Sylviana said that all her plans had gone awry because of them. She stood very determinedly. The girl waved her fan toward the floor and used her magic. As a result, she managed to deflect the guards' flaming arrows, but they then decided to cut her to pieces. One of the men tried to strike her with his sword, but Sylviana saved herself with her fan. Her magic caused the man with the sword to fall to the floor. But suddenly, one of the guards tied Sylviana's hand so that she dropped her magic fan. He declared that without her fan, Sylvie could do nothing and that she was now in their hands. The other men began to laugh and say that if you looked closely, she was beautiful. They would consult with Mr. Dryden about what to do with the girl after her capture. Sylviana just smiled and sarcastically asked if they really couldn't see her beauty right away. She called them completely blind. Her arm was still tied, and the fan lay on the floor. Suddenly, the girl jerked her bound hand and used magic. As a result, she managed to free herself and finish off the man who had tied her up. He flew into the wall with a crash and lay in a pool of blood. The girl declared that it was very low to whip a lady's hand, and she took back her fan. The other guards were frightened by her power, called her a monster, and began to run away. Sylvie smiled and replied that she had simply shaken him off. She added that it was very rude of them. Suddenly, the baby dragon began to growl. Another man appeared in the doorway, wearing a cloak and looking angry. It was Mr. Dryden. He asked in a low, stern voice what was going on. The guards were frightened and immediately called out to him. He saw Sylviana and declared with a haughty expression that it was very bold of her to sneak into the mansion like that. His sly smile was terrifying, but Sylviana was not afraid. She was ready for his arrival. The girl replied loudly that enough was enough with the pompous phrases. Sylviana stood directly in front of Dryden and the remaining guards. The hem of her dress fluttered gracefully. Behind the girl stood a cage with the little dragon she wanted to save. Dryden and his guards looked very stern. Meanwhile, Edgar returned. The prince held a search warrant for Dryden and the guards in his hands and immediately apologized to Sylvie for the wait. Suddenly, he realized that Sylviana was not there. He was outraged by her departure. After all, he had told her to wait quietly for him. Several men in uniforms began to approach the prince rapidly. They sarcastically informed the prince that he had been tricked and asked where his escort was. Edgar did not believe that Sylviana had broken into the mansion alone. He was afraid for her, for taking such a risk. The building was very intimidating. At that moment, Dryden and Sylviana began negotiations inside the mansion. Dryden calmly began to explain that their company sold jewelry for women. But, in his opinion, that wasn't why Sylvie had come here. He turned to her and asked what the young lady wanted. Dryden's gaze was very self-absorbed and haughty. The girl began to speak proudly, saying that she was an adventuress who had accepted an order to investigate the jewelry case. Dryden laughed at her introduction as an adventuress. Sylvie continued and said that she had heard that they were selling fakes of those very amulets, approved by an S-rank adventurer. Dryden calmly pretended not to understand and replied that their company sold only the most ordinary goods. Sylvie and Dryden were thinking about this same piece of jewelry. The man continued and said that if the craftsman hired by their company had made such items on his own initiative, then they could not be held responsible. He spread his arms and was about to get off scot-free. But Sylviana replied that was how they planned to avoid responsibility. Her shoe tapped sternly on the floor. The girl asked how Dryden and his company were going to justify selling monsters in cages. She pointed to all the cages standing nearby. Sylvie pointed out that they were selling not only ordinary monsters, but also dragons, and asked if these were also ordinary goods. The girl's gaze was angry. She and Dryden stood at a distance from each other. The man began to carefully take a knife out of his pocket. At the same time, he said that the fakes were just a diversionary tactic and that the bigger business should be kept in the shadows. He was calm, but a cunning plan formed in his head. Suddenly, Dryden threw many small sharp knives straight at the girl and threatened in a loud voice that he would have to silence her. The knives flew sharply at Sylviana. The guard stood nearby and praised Dryden. They happily said that it was great that Dryden's frenzied knife dance had begun, that Sylvie was finished. But the girl was not going to give up. She waved her fan, and all the knives fell to the floor almost at once, right at her feet. Dryden was horrified. He felt sorry for his magic-infused knives. Sylviana confidently said that Dryden was getting rid of witnesses as soon as things started to heat up. She considered this very primitive. The girl advised Dryden to use his head for more than just thinking about money. The man was unable to assess the strength of the enemy standing before him. Therefore, Sylvie called him a disgrace, hiding behind her fan. After these words, Dryden guessed that Sylviana was an adventuress, and he asked her about it. There was horror in his eyes, but Sylvie stood unshakable. Dryden thought the guild was bluffing, but the adventuress existed. Sylviana decided to introduce herself sarcastically to the man and announced that she was an S-rank adventurer. The guard were frightened. They advised Dryden to retreat. But, in his opinion, getting the dragon was too difficult to back down like that. The dragon cub sat in the cage, very quietly and calmly. The man believed that he too could not be caught in such a place. Suddenly, Dryden began to apologize. He asked her forgiveness and explained that he did not know she was an adventurer. He offered a deal. Sylviana was interested, but she was on her guard. Dryden offered to pay the girl 10% of all amulet sales. No, even 30%. He politely asked the girl to turn a blind eye to this. She immediately called him stupid. She didn't like the idea. Sylviana noticed that Dryden continued to insult her. She sternly told him that he had better stop producing and selling fakes right away. The girl came here not for money, but because she could not forgive this swindler's misdeeds. She began to shout and protest that it was wrong to put adventurers in danger for the sake of personal gain. She loudly called Dryden a shameless scoundrel. Her fists were clenched in anger, and her eyes were filled with rage. With her fan, the girl made all of Dryden's knives fly back at him and the guards. Sylviana declared resolutely that she would show the man real magic, and she raised her fan high. The knives flew swiftly toward the guilty parties. They were frightened, began to scream, begged for help, and not to be killed. But the girl just smiled and called Dryden a fool. Dryden and his guards flew into the wall and hung there, the knives stuck firmly into their bodies. Sylviana declared that she was not going to kill such worms. Sylvie announced that the royal guard would arrive soon and ordered everyone to sit quietly. The victims were unable to say a word after what had happened. The girl remarked sarcastically that she had been too hasty. She sat down on the floor and wearily pulled the cage with the little dragon closer to her. The little dragon let out a cry. Sylviana turned to it and asked if it was happy with her. The dragon cheerfully answered her, and the girl opened the cage door for it. Dryden was completely pinned to the wall at that moment and was angry about it. He had great difficulty getting the dragon out. The man was furious. Sylviana found a way to solve the problem. She sat next to the cage. The guild would take the dragon and resell it. It was better than letting someone steal it. Sylvie had not finished her thought when Dryden began to reach for the knife chained to the wall next to him. Suddenly, he threw it straight at the dragon, even though he was defenseless. The knife flew swiftly and quickly. The girl noticed this and was frightened for the dragon. But out of nowhere, Prince Edgar appeared. He shielded Sylviana and the dragon with his body and was able to defend himself with his magic sword. The prince was brave, fearless, and confident. Sylvie screamed. At that moment, Edgar turned to her and apologized for being late. He asked if she was okay. Sylvie smiled trustingly and replied that she was fine. She noted that Edgar had arrived at the perfect moment. The prince replied that she had not kept her promise. The young man's face showed fear and fatigue. The little dragon sat next to Sylviana. Suddenly, the prince stood up and raised his hand symbolically. He announced loudly and angrily that they had received a report of illegal trade taking place here. In the name of King Dryden, he and his workers would be arrested. The swindlers were also chained to the walls with knives and were angry that they had been found out. But after that, all the violators were bound with chains and taken into custody. They were led out of the mansion. Sylviana held the dragon close to her and protected it, frightened. She turned to Edgar and did not think that everything would turn into such a large raid. The prince stood nearby and replied that there was more than enough evidence. He said that he had warned Sylviana and asked her to wait for him outside instead of going alone. The girl politely apologized. She explained that she always had protective magic on her, so the knife was not dangerous, but she had been distracted by the baby dragon. The prince looked at it and smiled. Sylvie was curious where Dryden's company had found this baby dragon. The girl said they would soon return it home. The dragon looked at the group with loyal eyes and completely trusted its new owners. They were happy. and they realized that, in any case, the matter was closed. Sometime later, the prince was working in his office in the royal castle. He was signing some documents and reading papers. Next to him lay a huge stack of these documents. The prince looked very focused and a little tense. Meanwhile, Dryden was arrested on suspicion of illegal monster trading. The upcoming investigation would shed light on the details of the trade and past misdeeds. Jylan, the master forger, was also arrested. Edgar checked the documents and realized that, as Sylvie had said, the state would not be able to remain silent. They had stumbled upon a great crime that forced the country to take action. A servant came into Edgar's office, a man who worked at the castle, also holding papers in his hands. He was surprised that the prince was still working on the case at such an hour. Edgar politely replied that the guild had taken on the case, so everything was already in order, and the servant could rest. The man brought the prince some cookies and tea and placed them on the table in front of him. Edgar moved to the sofa in his office and enjoyed the cookies, but he was still thinking about work. He needed to confirm the upcoming negotiations. Christopher used to do this, and Edgar was still not used to this job. He remembered his brother and wondered how the removal of the curse was going. Edgar understood that the curse's influence on him had disappeared, but with such a mountain of work, fatigue was setting in. He sat discontentedly and shrugged his shoulders to relax a little. It was already dark outside. The other castle workers were also working late. The prince thought that Sylviana must be heading to the farm. He realized that he should probably stop following her. There was no longer any need for it. But, given the recent incidents, would she be able to handle it alone? Edgar's house was so cozy that he couldn't help but relax. And in the royal palace, there was only work which made him sick. The prince sat tiredly on the sofa, tilting his head back and closing his eyes from exhaustion. He put his hand on his forehead and frowned deeply. After that, he immediately got up from the sofa and realized that he should not relax now. The prince takes his work and state affairs very seriously. But suddenly he saw someone outside the door and tensed up. Christopher was walking down the hallway, looking downcast with his head bowed and his eyes half closed. He looked more like a zombie than a human being. Christopher noticed that Edgar was working quite late today. Edgar went to meet him. He admitted that he had been delayed a little because of the incident in Aldi. He asked Christopher if anything had happened to him. Christopher replied that he had heard that his brother was now going to work every day. Edgar immediately asked Christopher not to worry and said that the extra work was just a whim. He would not let it interfere with his official duties. Christopher said that the prince must be busy replacing him and dealing with the consequences. He sensed that he hated him for it. Edgar replied that this was not the case at all. Christopher didn't believe it and said that other aristocrats in the palace seemed to think so too. They said they were bothered by the prince's foolish antics. Christopher was a little angry, but he was sincere. Edgar didn't know what to think. He replied that he just wanted his brother to get better soon. The fact that Christopher had been cursed in the dungeon was an accident, and no one was to blame. Although, Edgar continued, his brother should have been more careful when choosing a place to walk. He was strict, and Christopher still looked unhappy. Edgar felt sorry for him. His brother's eyes were still very dead. Christopher had to visit the temple every day, but there was no noticeable improvement. Edgar decided to keep the conversation going and asked about Lady Kadia. He had heard that she had locked herself in the temple and was undergoing a process to remove the curse. They say she took the brunt of the curse upon herself. The fact that Christopher was not so badly affected was thanks to the protection of the royal amulet. Members of the royal family always wear an amulet that protects them from curses. However, this time the spell was able to break through the protection. The court magicians are now developing a new type of amulet that can withstand even ancient magic. Edgar was lost in thought. He needed to check on the progress of this matter. Sylvie would probably do it in the blink of an eye, but Edgar thought that the royal family should no longer burden Sylviana. He clutched his head and frowned again. Christopher suddenly said quietly that it seemed he would soon be severely punished. He said that if you look at it that way. Christopher slowly turned around and wearily walked away from his brother. Edgar didn't understand. Christopher slowly turned away and wearily walked away from his brother. Edgar didn't understand, but he wanted his brother to get back on his feet. The fact remains that Christopher hurt Sylvie with his foolish actions. But Edgar didn't have the strength to scold him now. He was very tired and sad. However, all he could do was take over his work. If his brother himself had no desire to change, no matter how much Edgar reached out to help him. A new day dawned. Shortly thereafter, the Dryden Company was disbanded due to numerous arrests. It seemed that trade in Aldi would descend into chaos, but the bad reputation that had spread earlier was forgotten. On the contrary, the unity of the townspeople only grew stronger. The captured monsters were properly disposed of in cooperation with the guild. It was decided to return the dragon to the wild. Edgar came to visit Sylviana. He asked her what she was doing. The girl stood indignantly near the table, which was littered with food, chicken, bread, vegetables, milk, and other items. Nearby, also on the table, sat a little dragon, who was also not in the best of moods. Sylviana replied that she was looking for food for the baby, pointing to the dragon. But it seemed that he didn't like any of the food. Edgar said that wasn't the point, and he was wondering why the dragon was there. Because the girl was supposed to give it to the guild. The prince picked up the dragon with his hand, and it began to kick. Sylvie said that the dragon would live here until they figured out its habitat. That's how it was. She had agreed on this with the guild master. And Sylvie said that, in general, she would look after it for now. It seems that it has become attached to her. Edgar stood nearby and suggested that perhaps the dragon had recognized her as a friend. The baby went to the table and began sniffing the scattered food. Sylvie thinks that if it had parents, it would be difficult to kidnap it. And perhaps the dragon was alone from the beginning. They stood with Edgar, looked at the dragon, and felt a little sad. The prince noted that they now had a problem with feeding it. Sylvie indignantly replied that she had prepared so much food, and the result was 0. What do dragons eat anyway? Edgar asked what the Dryden people fed the little dragon. Sylvie replied that they didn't feed it anything there. She said that dragons are resilient, and it's easier to train them when they are a little weakened. The girl was sure that they should have been beaten harder. She would not forgive them. She was angry. But soon Sylvie bent down and opened the cupboard under the table. It was the food storage area in her house. She wondered if there was anything suitable for the dragon left there. But suddenly the cub jumped sharply from the table down into the cupboard. Sylvie jumped back and noticed with alarm that the cub was very fast. Edgar was standing behind her and replied that this was to be expected from a dragon. This cupboard was a storage room with spatial magic applied to it. It could hold an infinite number of items and keep them fresh. Sylviana sternly ordered the little dragon to get out and forbade him from rummaging around in there. She picked him up and took him out of the storage room. But it grabbed a large, juicy apple in its paws and was happy. Sylvie was surprised that it needed apples. She thought dragons were carnivores. But then the girl was delighted, took a large basket of fruit, and gave it to the dragon. But it turned away with only one apple in its paws. The little dragon only wanted apples. In the end, Sylviana gave him a whole plate of apples. And he was even happier. The girl realized that the dragon only ate apples from the dungeon and was outraged. Not only was it picky, but it was also a gourmet. She began to beat her hands on the floor in frustration. Edgar watched this, laughed, and asked Sylviana not to be so angry. She was indignant that the prince was laughing. He laughed because it was rare to see someone treat Sylvie like that. That's what dragons eat. It's not his fault. Sylviana got up from the floor, and the cub continued to eat the delicious apples. Sylvie said that apples from the dungeon were very hard to come by, but at least she was glad they had found food for the dragon. Edgar asked if she would give it a name. The girl replied that she had thought about it a lot, but hadn't come up with anything yet. She began to list possible names. Draco, it turned away. Drakey, it turned away in the other direction. Drachon, it turned its head in dissatisfaction. Sylvie spread her arms and confirmed that the little dragon was capricious. The prince declared that such names were very banal. He suggested taking a name from myths or legends, because the baby clearly wanted something cooler. Sylvie said that the dragon itself was very round and chubby. Suddenly, Edgar said his version of the name, Gyunion, and asked how about that. The dragon cub did not turn away and sat quietly. Sylvie noticed that it was the name of an ancient hero, the one who defeated the evil demon king by borrowing the power of Saint Edine. The girl thought she had read about him in her childhood, or maybe it was in the game lore. Sylvie turned to the dragon Gyunion. He cheerfully replied, waving his paws. Edgar noted that the dragon seemed to like it, and from today, it was now Gyunion. Sylviana said again that Gyunion was very capricious. The three of them played happily together. The girl said that they would need to go get some apples for Gyunion soon. She couldn't remember which dungeon the apples grew in. Edgar suggested bringing the apples from the royal palace for now. Sylvie began to clear the scattered food from a table. Suddenly, they heard a knock at the door. The children turned around sharply. Sylviana asked Edgar to watch the baby for a moment and went to open the door. Gyunion was already in the prince's arms. The girl carefully opened the door to see who could be visiting at such an hour. Standing on the threshold were an unknown boy and girl in robes. They joyfully called out Sylvie's name and greeted her. Edgar heard this and ran to the door, frightened, asking what happened. The unknown girl's name was Therese, and the boy next to her was Zeal. Sylviana recognized them immediately and began to hug them in greeting. They were very happy and laughed. Sylvie asked where they had come from and how they had ended up at her house. Therese replied that they had asked the guild for Sylvie's address. Zeal smiled and said that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. Therese came closer to Sylviana and gave her a light, friendly slap on the back. She reminded Sylvie of her promise, that she was supposed to write them a letter after she finished moving. Sylvie remembered and apologized, saying that she had been very busy. Therese asked if the girl wasn't supposed to lead a quiet, measured life. Sylvie just scratched the back of her head and smiled. Edgar stood behind the door watching, with the dragon cub in his arms. He was a little upset that Therese had patted Sylviana. He wondered who she was. Therese and Zeal noticed the prince in the doorway. They also wondered why he was at Sylvie's house. Edgar approached them and was very tense. He was surprised that the kids knew him, since they addressed him by name. Zeal and Therese replied that of course they knew him. Sylviana stood between them and introduced them. Therese and Zeal are her fellow adventurers. Therese suggested that Sylvie go to the dungeon with them. Sylviana was surprised by this invitation. Edgar was just as surprised as she was. He still held Gyunion in his hands. Therese is an A-rank adventurer specializing in magic. Zeal is an A-rank adventurer, a two-handed swordsman who also wields a one-handed sword and shield. Sylviana, Edgar, Therese, and Zeal sat down at the table and began to get to know each other better. Therese told Edgar that she and Sylvie used to go to the dungeon often. They are also graduates of the Academy of Saint Edine. Zeal smiled and said that Sylviana was younger than them, but far surpassed them in ability, and that it was only thanks to her that they quickly rose to rank A. Zeal asked why His Highness Edgar was sitting with them too. Therese saw the little dragon and asked about it as well. The prince sat silently and listened, and Sylviana replied that it was a little difficult to explain. She immediately turned to Edgar and told him that she had told the others everything about the ducal family and the broken engagement. The prince immediately felt ashamed and bowed his head guiltily. He apologized to Zeal and Therese for his brother's terrible behavior toward the engagement and Sylvie. Therese immediately waved her hands and asked him to stop apologizing. Zeal replied that if he were a prince, he would have behaved much more arrogantly. But Edgar did not stop and bowed to them in apology. Sylviana looked at him and thought he was funny. She said that the prince didn't seem very royal, but Edgar was a man who could truly be trusted. He sat nearby, a little embarrassed, and asked to be treated like a regular adventurer. The guests understood his request and didn't resist. Gyunion lay quietly on the floor next to them. Therese decided to ask about the dungeon again. Zeal happily announced that something new had been discovered nearby. A dungeon is an ancient ruin or cave filled with magical power and spawning monsters. It is unknown what dangers might lie there. High-ranking adventurers are sent out to scout it out first. Therese said that they had received a request for exploration, so she thought Sylviana might want to go with them. The members of the had big smiles on their faces. Zeal said that all the dungeons in the area had long been cleared, so a new dungeon was a rare find. The guys would be very happy if Sylvie went with them. Edgar listened to their conversation and noticed that Sylviana's friends got along very well with her. He was even touched by this and smiled. Sylvie thought that there must be apples in the unexplored dungeon, and she became curious. She and Edgar thought about it. The prince asked if the ruins had turned into a dungeon. Zeal replied that no, most likely they were natural caves, and that the guild had posted guards at the entrance so that no one could enter without permission. Edgar realized that everything was under proper control. He politely asked to go with them. Sylviana was sitting nearby, turned to him, and was very surprised. Edgar explained that he would like to experience all this for himself, and that he was unlikely to have another chance like this. Besides, if these ruins had turned into a dungeon for a reason, was there a danger that some kind of curse would be placed on them? He immediately remembered the curse on Christopher and Katia. His face was serious. Zeal and Therese replied that such a possibility did indeed exist, but with the king's permission, everything would be fine. Sylviana said that if Edgar went with them, she didn't think anything would happen. Therese was very happy. Zeal happily turned to His Highness and said that they would be pleased to cooperate, and the guys set off to explore the dungeon. Everyone is very energetic and active, ready for adventure. Everyone is happy. Edgar said that they first needed to prepare their equipment. There were 2 guest rooms on the 2nd floor, so the guests could settle in there. Therese thanked Edgar and Sylvie for their warm welcome. A few days later, they went on an excursion. Gyunion was appointed head of the house and left alone. The weather outside was warm, with not a cloud in the sky. Everything was going very well. Sylviana began to warn and teach Gyunion that there were apples in the house, and that the boys would not return until evening. But she ordered the dragon not to dare touch the apples on the shelf, because they were for emergencies. Bad people might show up outside the house, and Sylviana asked Gyunion not to let them hurt him. Gyunion made a happy sound and waved his paw as if he really understood everything. Edgar stood nearby and said that it was time for them to go. The kids were already in their gear, dressed and protected. But Sylviana said she was still worried about the house and Gyunion. She suggested making a golem for protection, just to be safe. Edgar picked Gyunion up and was surprised that the girl also knew how to make golems. But, in fact, it would be her first time doing so. But that didn't bother her. Sylvie and Edgar went out into the yard and got to work. 3 small piles of earth instantly appeared on the ground, and Sylviana placed 1 magic stone on each of them. She called upon the spirit of the earth for help. Suddenly, these mounds of earth with stones, these turned into 3 magical creatures, strange, with hands and eyes. They addressed the girl as their master and waited for her orders. Gyunyan was a little scared. Sylviana leaned toward the creatures and ordered them to protect this house, to warn passers-by, and if they ignored the warnings, to eliminate them. She strictly stated that no one should be killed. The guardian creatures obeyed her. Sylvie thought the creatures looked a little strange and weak, but Edgar convinced her that if she was able to create 3 at once on her first try, that was more than enough. Suddenly, several people from the guild arrived at the girl's yard in a cart and called out to her. The cart was drawn by 2 horses and ready to depart. The guys will use it to go to the dungeon. Sylvie and Edgar said goodbye to Gyunyan and left. Zeal and Therese joined them. They got into the carriage and set off. Sylviana immediately took 3 magical amulets out of her pocket to protect all her friends. Edgar noticed that these were items for S-class adventurers, and a magic crystal was very expensive. Sylvie replied that it was no big deal and that she was giving her friends a discount. Zeal said that they would definitely pay her for the amulets. Everyone laughed together. There was a very nice and calm atmosphere among the friends, but there were several other people riding nearby. They were adventurers from another city. They didn't look very friendly, and there was a tense atmosphere around them. These unknown guys were discussing Edgar, realizing that he was not a veteran adventurer and that this was his first trip. Therese looked at them suspiciously. Zeal was indignant that they must have heard rumors about the new dungeon and come here. He quietly asked Edgar not to look at them. The prince smiled and obeyed, but asked not to be called by his name. Sylviana sat silently and thought. These unknown adventurers were sitting right next to her. Suddenly, she decided to turn to them and sarcastically apologize for her and her friends being so noisy. The adventurers did not want to interact with her and moved away unfriendly. Sylviana told them that Edgar was actually a scientist and pointed at him. She said that he was studying the origin of dungeons and that the guild had asked him to go with them, and that he, by the way, was also a graduate of the Academy of St. Edine with an adventurer's license. The guys were surprised by this, but were still unfriendly. Sylvie looked at them and politely asked them to be careful so they could work together. The guys moved a little further away. Edgar didn't show it, but he didn't expect to be introduced as a scientist. Zeal replied that he shouldn't worry about it. Let it be. Meanwhile, the horse-drawn carriage had already reached the desired underground passage, and the guy stopped there. In front of them was a huge cave, not yet explored. It stood among the trees, and mountains were visible in the distance. In front of the cave was a small wooden kiosk, similar to a ticket office, with a guard inside. Before entering the underground, adventurous visitors had to approach this guard and ask for permission to enter. The guys got out of the carriage and admired the underground. Zeal didn't even notice the small entrance to it first. Edgar saw the small registration kiosk and asked if that was where they needed to go. Sylviana and Therese walked a little further away from the carriage and hid behind some rocks. Edgar and Zeal saw them and went over to ask what they were doing. It turned out that there was a teleportation circle next to them, which Sylvie had created. She told them that it would be easier to return this way. Therese laughed and said that creating a teleportation circle was the first trick they used when going underground with Sylvie. The guys were in high spirits. They went to the registration desk and signed in. Therese had her magic staff with her, and Zeal had his big sword. After registering, the group bowed to the guard, thanked him, and headed for the entrance to the dungeon. It was very dark there. Sylviana said fearfully that this dungeon was not one where tricks could be used. But Therese was not afraid and lit the light on her staff. As a result, the dungeon was illuminated by a bright light, as if from a light bulb. Sylvie called on the spirit Terra for help. She asked it to split into several parts and go deep into the dungeon to scout the area. Edgar didn't think spirits could split, but it was within their power. Sylviana explained to the others that Terra would go ahead of them and scout the situation for them. Therese called this trick number 2, avoiding danger. She said that, in general, they usually had to move forward cautiously, using reconnaissance magic. But that was very troublesome. Zeal replied that only Sylvie, with her endless supply of magic, was capable of doing that. They cheerfully continued to go further and further. Zeal noticed that this dungeon was quite spacious. Therese asked them to wait because she wanted to get a map. They create maps of dungeons during their travels and then sell them to the guild for a high price. The spirit Terra informed Sylviana that the path ahead branched off. She asked where they would go, left or right. Zeal inquired which way the cleanup was going. Sylvie replied that there seemed to be more adventurers on the left. Zeal then decisively declared that they would go right. Edgar confirmed that this would indeed be convenient. Sylviana turned to Edgar and asked him to always remember the way back. The prince did not understand. The girl explained to him that he had to make sure he knew the way back. This was in case strong enemies appeared. Edgar replied seriously that he understood now. Tara warned the group that monsters were approaching, specifically a group of goblins. But the friends were not afraid and resolutely prepared for the attack. Zeal was confident that they would smash the monsters to smithereens. The goblins were already close. Therese was the first to activate her magic and create a fireball against the monsters. It flew straight at the goblins and hit them. Immediately after that, Zeal took out his broadsword and tore the monsters apart so that they flew off in different directions. Edgar also wanted to take part in defending against the monsters, but Zeal asked him not to rush forward so recklessly. The prince did not resist. Therese asked Sylviana to warm up. The prince admired their fight and said that Therese and Zeal were incredible people. Sylvie noticed that she seemed to have nothing to do here. But Edgar did not give up. He asked for a chance to fight too. He was very confident and determined. Zeal asked if the prince was really ready. And the prince was ready as ever. His eyes lit up. He jumped into the air and cut the monster in half with his magic sword. Zeal and Therese praised the prince and told him he had done well. Sylviana smiled, agreed, and said they shouldn't worry because Edgar was a truly reliable adventurer. The prince was a little dazed from his first experience fighting in the dungeon, but Zeal put his arm around his shoulders in a friendly manner and calmed him down. The goblins were completely stunned. The children emerged from the dungeon and, as a reward for their victory, were presented with homemade food brought by Sylviana. They spread out and began to eat. Therese declared that Sylvie's homemade food was divine. Edgar was surprised that Sylvie had brought all the food in a bottomless bag, but he was very happy. The girl handed Zeal a plate of soup. Zeal said that he usually had to eat canned food. Edgar agreed and said that even his usual meals were not as luxurious as this one. They were very happy. Sylviana explained that she hadn't gone camping with everyone for a long time, so she had made an effort and prepared all kinds of food. Suddenly, the girl saw an apple tree nearby and told the others about it. She immediately realized that they had found food for Union. She suggested harvesting the fruit, but Zeal said they should eat first. It was good that they had lunch with them, and with Sylvie around, it was almost like a picnic. The girl thought that even though they were still at the entrance, the difficulty level was not high. She turned to look at the entrance to the dungeon. After a while, the travelers returned home. Sylvie immediately flew into the house first and asked Union if he had behaved well while they were away. But she saw a terrible sight. The dragon was sitting in the middle of a big mess in the kitchen. Vegetables, fruits, grains, and other food were scattered everywhere. Milk was spilled, and dishes were broken. Sylviana was horrified. She was upset that she had asked Union to be a good boy, but he had not listened to her. The dragon just looked happily at his mistress. A new day dawned. Outside the window, the sun was shining brightly, and the weather was warm and beautiful. Sylviana had been cooking something in the kitchen since early morning and was in high spirits. She was wearing an apron. She was cracking eggs into a bowl, and next to her on the table lay a cutting board and a knife. She finally chopped the bacon on the board and sent it to the frying pan to cook. The kettle was already boiling, and the cooking process looked very active. The girl made an omelet with bacon and cheese for her friends for breakfast. Sylvie went to wake Therese and Zeal for breakfast because they were still asleep. Today, another trip to the dungeon awaited them. The guys came out of their bedrooms in their pajamas, stretching and yawning sweetly. Edgar had already arrived and wished everyone good morning. Sylvie set the table and put plates of omelet in front of everyone, while the prince helped her. Therese was surprised that Edgar had arrived so quickly. Sylvie replied with a laugh that they had simply overslept his arrival. Therese said that the beds in Sylvie's house were just very comfortable. Everyone sat down at the table. By the way, Edgar lives in a separate estate belonging to the Lord. It was located in the capital. Edgar traveled to Ouji by carriage, but he could walk to Sylvie's house. If the guys worked hard in the dungeon today, they could take tomorrow off. The friends were delighted with this plan and praised Sylvie's divine omelet. They finished breakfast and immediately set off. The sky was clear and the weather was wonderful. They were now in the middle of exploring a new dungeon. Sylviana ordered everyone to move forward and stick together. Thanks to the teleportation circle, they could explore the dungeon, return home at night, and have 2 days off per week. Meanwhile, the teleportation circle activated, and the 4 adventurers immediately found themselves at their destination. They were also equipped and ready for battle. They arrived at the location where they had concluded their previous day's activities and defeated the goblin monsters. Typically, when entering a dungeon, one would continue their exploration after setting up camp. But the map had been updated. Sylviana said that, besides them, many other adventurers come here, so it's not surprising. The map was in Teresa's hands, just like yesterday. Zeal looked at the map and noticed that information had spread that this was a medium-level dungeon. He was indignant that all the other adventurers had rushed here right away. This time, Union was with the group. He sat on Edgar's shoulders, enjoying the excitement and looking around. The prince hoped that the dragon would be well-behaved today. They decided to take him with them to protect their home. It would be easier that way. Therese noticed and told Edgar that he had already settled in completely. Sylvie replied that the prince was helping her look after Union, and that was a great help. But suddenly the children turned around and saw something terrible and frowned. Edgar put Union on the ground and asked him to stand still. It was time for training. A lot of slime appeared on the cave rocks. Sylviana turned to Edgar and asked him what was special about weed slime. The prince explained that physical attacks are ineffective against weed slime, and sword would be useless. But they are weak against fire. So the prince decided to strike the slime with his thunder sword. He swung in the air and aimed it hard at the slime. As a result, the slime immediately disappeared and dissolved from the prince's magic. Therese praised Edgar and said it was amazing. Sylviana really dislikes such slime, so she was glad that the prince instantly destroyed them. Therese turned to him and said that his level was rising very quickly. If Edgar passed the test, he would receive a B rank. She was very happy for him. Edgar explained that it was all thanks to them. Sylviana replied that this was true because the dungeon was ideal for training, and it seemed that the amulets she had made would also come in handy. This was very pleasing to the girl. Once again, the group left the dungeon and took a lunch break outside. Sylvie had prepared dorayaki with seafood for them today. She tried making it with salmon, squid, and fried oysters. It was the girl's secret recipe. Therese took her portion and praised her friend, saying that it was to be expected of her. Sylvie explained that she just wanted the research to be comfortable. Edgar thought that she was at it again. Zeal laughed and said that Sylvie really disliked sleeping in the camp. It was so unlike her. She was a little upset by Zeal's teasing. Edgar silently and happily ate her divine lunch. Zeal began to talk about how he met Sylviana. He met her through the guild 3 years ago. At that time, the guild master asked Therese and Zeal to take little Sylvie with them to the dungeon because she really wanted to go. Therese didn't mind, but Zeal wasn't thrilled because the girl was still a child, but he agreed anyway. When Sylviana was 15, she didn't seem to be thinking about getting used to dungeons. But she fought fiercely and skillfully and showed impressive results. All the adventurers at the time were surprised by her talent, including Zeal and Therese. The investigation lasted a week, and little Sylviana hated sleeping in sleeping bags during the investigations. She was capricious and woke everyone up. The girl declared that she no longer wanted to sleep in such conditions and wanted to go home to sleep in her bed. She waved her arms and legs, screamed, fought, and cried. Everyone tried to calm her down. Therese asked her to rest and stop being nervous. They were even a little angry with her, but she teleported everyone to her home. She immediately ran to her mother, who was surprised that her daughter had returned from her research so quickly. The woman asked Zeal and Therese to stay with Sylvie at her home. They were tired and upset. Zeal told all his friends this story. That's how they found out that Sylviana was the Duke's daughter. Edgar asked them if Sylvie also had funny moments sometimes. He smiled and was happy to hear the children's story. But Sylvie felt a little uncomfortable with the memories, though she was not offended, but rather embarrassed. The prince turned to her and remembered that she had said that at the age of 10, she had been thrown into a dungeon. The girl replied that before that they had always returned home at night. Anyone would be stressed if they had to sleep on hard ground for 2 weeks. Zeal said that she should have gotten used to it. He said that he now understood her because of the comfortable research and delicious food. Zeal picked up a chicken leg and ate it very appetizingly. Therese sat next to him and said that they would not be able to repeat this again because Sylvie already had one big kid at home. Edgar immediately tensed up and realized they were talking about him. He sat with the dragon cub in his arms and asked if they were really talking about him. They replied that there was no more suitable option. Therese turned to Sylviana and asked why the prince didn't live with her, since he came so early every morning anyway. Edgar couldn't answer. Sylvie asked him to show her some respect as the lady of the house. Zeal started laughing. And so, the guys had lunch and saw another apple tree with juicy fruit among the rocks and mountains. Union was very happy. Sylvie warned that they couldn't eat it, but it would be better to harvest it and take it home. Therese asked fearfully what would happen if Union ate only apples and nothing else. Sylvie replied that this would not happen, but if he continued to grow like this, he would no longer fit in her arms. Union was also eating delicious apples at that moment. Sylviana already had a picture in her mind of the big, grown-up dragon Union devouring an entire apple tree in one bite. Edgar warned that they were still in the research stage and needed to observe everything carefully. Zeal turned to him and suggested picking apples. He was already holding a basket for the harvest. But Edgar was behind the apple tree. He discovered a large crop of radishes and told Sylviana about it. He picked up one of the fruits and said that he still remembered the radish that had been in her yard back then. Sylvie asked how long he could keep remembering that event. She said that she hadn't delivered it to His Highness for a long time. And by the way, he asked her to accept an order for harvesting. Edgar heard this and became a little sad, looking down guiltily. He was worried about this. He said that the girl shouldn't overexert herself, because visiting the royal palace was probably difficult for her. Sylviana didn't understand what he was getting at and was a little taken aback. The prince asked sadly if he couldn't take it to the royal palace himself. After all, he didn't have any orders anyway. Sylviana also became sad and replied that he was right. She really had no reason to go to the palace. The girl picked up the radish and smiled. Edgar said he was worried about going there, and Sylviana interrupted him. She thanked the prince for worrying about her, but she herself was worried about what the royal palace thought of the prince's adventures here. Edgar was still tense, and Gunyan was sitting on his shoulder. Sylviana didn't want Edgar's situation to worsen again because of her. After all, Edgar had gone mad because of the curse. Wasn't she partly responsible for this whole series of events? It would be fair to blame her. The girl thinks she should have acted differently. She lowered her head, and her gaze became sad again. His Highness Christopher is ill, and his condition is not improving. And even though Edgar tells Sylviana not to worry, she can't help it. The same thing happened with Lady Katia. And again, Sylviana was left behind. Without breaking off the engagement, she would have been executed or defeated as the final boss. The villain, Sylviana Melcarini. It was difficult for her to understand how best to deal with such a character from the game, so she thought only about how to defend herself. Sylviana's stream of thoughts gave her no peace. In order not to follow the execution plot, she obediently played the role of the Duke's daughter so that the annulment of the engagement would go smoothly. And behind the scenes, the girl improved her abilities and earned money to enjoy her future life. For the sake of her own desires, Sylviana abandoned Christopher. As a result, the misfortune that was supposed to befall the girl fell upon him. Sylvie was very sad. She thinks too much, but Edgar comes to see her so often. She worries about it, but all that remains is to cherish these days as the happiest in the girl's life. The prince helps her with everything, plays with Gunyan, and treats her well. Soon the guys returned home from the dungeon. A new day dawned. Everyone gathered for breakfast in Sylvie's kitchen, everyone except Edgar. Zeal was very happy about the day off. Therese started cooking instead of Sylvie today and told her to rest. The girl eagerly awaited the food from her partner, and Gunyan lay obediently on the hostess's lap. Zeal asked if Edgar had arrived yet. Sylvie replied that the prince was busy working on documents. There was an unknown letter on the table in front of the guys. Sylvie picked it up to read it. Zeal asked about it. The girl replied that the letter was about a summons to the royal palace. She read the contents carefully and cautiously. Zeal was also curious. The letter requested their arrival to discuss a marriage alliance between the House of Millennium and the House of Melcarini. Therese came closer to listen. Sylviana reported that the investigation into the annulment of the engagement had been completed and that Christopher's punishment had probably been determined. The girl suggested that she had probably been summoned to witness this. Zeal asked, then why not call Edgar and go on a reconnaissance mission on his day off? Sylvie replied that it was a good idea. Suddenly, Gunyan made a sound. That meant Edgar had arrived. He entered the kitchen. He said that Gunyan had brought him there. He asked what was going on. Sylviana showed him the letter and asked if the prince hadn't heard about it. The guy took the letter and read about the summons from the palace. He said that he really hadn't heard anything about it. The girl didn't believe him and was surprised. The prince said that if this matter concerned his older brother, then Sylviana no longer needed to be present. She replied that she could not ignore this letter and would come as Christopher's former fiancé. Edgar did not try to dissuade her. Sylviana took the letter back and began to think. Edgar knew nothing, and she wondered if something had changed. What was the letter about? She was tense and a little upset. The letter was about marriage. Suddenly, the girl's eyes widened in fear. She realized that it was not just about breaking off her engagement to Christopher. Prince Edgar stood tense and serious as well. In the background, Therese and Zeal were having fun with Gunyan and announced that they would stay home. Sylviana is getting ready for a call to the royal palace. She was at her parents' ducal house. A young maid is helping her get dressed. Sylvie sits in front of the mirror, wearing a long dark dress with a fluffy hem and small black shoes. Her hair is neatly gathered and curled. The sun is shining outside the window, and it looks like it's going to be an interesting day. The girl descended the high staircase from her room to the first floor, her heels clicking softly. But her face was not particularly joyful, even a little melancholic. Sylviana was greeted by her parents. Her mother admired the fact that the girl was wearing a very modest dress today. Sylvie explained that she was going to the royal palace to break off her engagement, and that it would be bad form to go there in a bright red battle dress. Her father just laughed and replied that she could have shown how well she was living. Sylviana was not in such a good mood. She said it was time for her to go. The servants, maids, and workers of the ducal house stood nearby and wished her a safe journey. Her father turned to her and said that they would increase security at the house just in case. And they went to the exit. The man cautiously hoped that the conflict would not reach the castle. Sylviana did not quite understand what he meant. Then he replied that he had not yet forgiven the countless insults that the royal family had inflicted on the girl. His gaze was quite serious. Her father declared that if they dared to say one more stupid thing. Sylviana immediately realized that the atmosphere was tense and that she needed to be on her guard. She held a fan in her hands, looking very determined and a little sad. His Highness Christopher. Most likely, he would be punished with house arrest. In the worst case, he would be deprived of his right to inheritance. If that happened, the right of inheritance would pass to the second son, Edgar. And Sylviana already guessed what that might mean. It could mean that she would be engaged to Edgar. She thinks it's very obvious. Sylvie is the Duke's daughter, who has already been trained to be a princess. There is no more suitable candidate for marriage. She and Edgar are the same age and have known each other for a long time. Sylviana is not particularly happy with her conclusions. She thinks that if it comes to a real engagement with Edgar, then her life on the farm will be over. She found herself in the royal palace. Immediately before her were the king, sitting on his throne, Prince Edgar, and Prince Christopher. Edgar was calm and composed, as usual. Christopher leaned heavily toward the floor, his head bowed, looking a little angry and dissatisfied, as if in pain. They were immediately informed that Lady Sylviana Melcarini had arrived. She stood and suddenly said that this was her first time here since the day her engagement was broken off. It was hard for her to see Prince Christopher's face again. The girl had heard all sorts of things about him, but everything was much worse. There was not a single emotion on her face. She noticed that Prince Edgar was already there, which meant that everything was turning out just as she had thought. The king turned to Lady Sylviana and greeted her. The girl greeted His Highness in return. Sylvie's parents were standing nearby. The king immediately began his calm but important speech. He announced that he would first report on Christopher's punishment. As for the annulment of the engagement, his behavior was inappropriate. Christopher led students who had not yet received their licenses into a dangerous dungeon, picked up a curse, and spread it throughout the neighborhood. This was an outrageous act. The king promised that they would impose a severe punishment. Christopher is stripped of his right to the throne and banished to other lands. The right of succession is transferred to the second prince, Edgar. At that moment, Edgar stood motionless and silent. Christopher was curled up in a ball, overcome with remorse and pain. Sylviana thought that exile was a harsher punishment than she had imagined. Her eyes widened in surprise. She thought that, having lost his right of succession, Christopher would still remain in the royal palace, without a title in distant lands. The girl thinks that, looking at the situation, it seems similar to her own. But this is not a voluntary departure from affairs. For her, it was all over back then. She received generous compensation and wanted to punish him even more. But, suddenly, Sylviana's train of thought was interrupted by the king's voice. He addressed her. He announced that they wanted to provide the next candidate with a worthy queen. Sylviana immediately realized that it had begun. Horror appeared in her eyes. The girl's mother and father began to get a little upset. Edgar's face changed, becoming slightly malicious and pale. The king announced that the second prince was Edgar Millennium and Sylviana Melcarini. But Edgar interrupted him with a shout. He shouted indignantly at his father that he could not act so recklessly. Sylvie was surprised by the prince's sudden anger. He continued and asked why, if they had called him, they had not warned him about anything. He had heard about his rights to the throne, but not about the engagement. The girl realized that Edgar was also hearing about it for the first time. In this meeting, Prince Edgar asked if it was true that he had been told to be here for this reason. Christopher, meanwhile, decided to move away and sit down on a chair, hunched over in pain. Edgar wondered if they had decided not to tell him just so that he wouldn't try to stop it. If it was the king's word, then it could not be disputed. The king had not said a word, and the prince continued. He said he had no objection to inheriting the throne. If he was ordered to do so, he would humbly accept it. However, in Prince Edgar's opinion, it was inappropriate to involve Lady Sylviana in this matter. He said this very seriously and decisively. Sylviana stood in shock. The prince continued. The royal family had treated Sylvie terribly, and, in his opinion, this should be taken into account. They had forced her to marry Christopher, made her work as an adventurer, and ultimately broke off the engagement. Edgar shouted that another engagement was too much. He was angry and loudly indignant. He even went to the girl's farm with the intention of watching her, but she made it clear to him that she lives freely and easily, and the strength with which she energizes everyone around her should not be suppressed by the decision to get engaged. Edgar was strict and serious as never before. Sylviana was delighted with him. Her parents were also in shock, their faces stony, because they did not expect such a speech from Prince Edgar. The king stared into space, sitting motionless. Christopher looked even worse, but he wasn't listening to his brother, thinking about his own thoughts. Sylviana realized that His Majesty the King had not yet said anything about the engagement. She still could not fully understand why Prince Edgar was so angry. The girl covered her smile with a fan, for the sake of propriety. Yes, Edgar was helping her with the farm work. Instead of paying him for breaking off the engagement, Sylviana was using him as a laborer. But now he was a precious friend to her. The girl declared aloud that there could be no question of an engagement. She appealed to His Majesty and was sure that he wanted her and Edgar to remain friends. The king could not come up with a meaningful response. Sylviana's parents joined the conversation. Her father stepped forward and asked them to pretend they had not heard anything about the engagement. He explained that they wanted to respect their daughter's feelings. This was not meant to be negative towards the royal family. The king wanted to tell Duke Melcarini about certain circumstances and explain himself, but he was interrupted. The duke approached the king and asked if he was so afraid of losing his throne that he would neglect his daughter. The girl's father had a slight smirk on his face, and the king visibly tensed up. Sylvie's mother said that if this decision upset their daughter, they would consider changing the ruler. She hugged Sylvie and smiled at her, but the girl did not want this. Sylviana shouted that they were all overreacting. She asked her mother not to hold her. Prince Edgar bowed deeply to Duke Melcarini and apologized for the king's rash words, and he seriously ordered them to stop. Sylviana's father said that if the prince said so, then yes, seizing the throne was a troublesome business, and he decided to leave it for later. No one resisted anyone. The duke and duchess led Sylviana closer to the doors and began to leave. Before leaving, the girl's father said goodbye to His Majesty and said that they were done for the day. Sylviana thanked Edgar for understanding her feelings. She did not want engagement. He stood with a smile on his face and watched the Melcarini ducal family leave. Finally, Sylvie's calm, measured life continues, even if it was starting out a little noisier than she had imagined. But for now, the girl didn't want to change that. She still has to achieve the dreams of her past life and the goals of this one. On leaving the royal castle, Sylviana's family had a conversation. She was indignant that her father did not want conflict, but had almost created it himself. She was glad that her parents were protecting her, but this was too much. Her mother and father just smiled at her and said there was nothing they could do. For them, their daughter's happiness came first. Sylviana couldn't say anything against them. The duke thought that His Highness Edgar was not a timid man. He boldly objected to the king and was not even afraid of the duke intervening in the conversation. The man asked Sylvie if Prince Edgar could be trusted, to which the girl confidently replied that he could. The duke asked if Prince Edgar really visited her farm so often. The girl couldn't answer this question because she didn't understand why her father was asking it. Her mother immediately added that Sylviana and Edgar looked cute together and laughed. The girl indignantly said that she and the prince were just friends. And yet His Highness Christopher continued to haunt Sylviana's thoughts. She thought about him and felt sorry for him. Exile was too harsh a punishment for him. They didn't talk about it, but it seemed that Christopher had committed many other offenses: embezzlement of public funds, abuse of subordinates, and use of illegal drugs. The girl was tense and frightened. These were illegal stimulants. It seemed that Christopher took them himself and forced his fellow adventurers to take them when entering the dungeons. Moreover, to strengthen Lady Kadia's position, he sent thugs to the nobles who did not want to support her. The duke said that the curse was not an excuse at all. Rather, it was a mitigating factor so that Christopher would not be imprisoned. Sylviana was tormented by the question of how Prince Christopher had come to this. If only she had been a little more attentive. But suddenly the girl turned around, and in the distance of the royal corridor, she saw something dark. She asked her mom and dad to go first. They wanted to object, but the girl interrupted them. Sylvie told them that everything was fine. She would just talk to him. There was no worthy rival for her in this palace. And in the corridor, it turned out Prince Christopher was walking with heavy steps. Sylviana's parents went ahead, but said that at this pace they would get nowhere. Sylvie and Prince Christopher met, and the girl was confidently ready to end it all. The prince looked very bad, but there was rage in his eyes. The guy yelled at the girl and accused her, saying that it was all her fault. Sylviana asked in response, what exactly was she guilty of? He explained that because of the humiliation at the prom, his confidence had plummeted. Christopher believes that it was because of Sylviana that he found himself in such a painful situation, and he doesn't like her constant arrogance. He even pointed his finger at her maliciously. The girl did not lose her composure, even in this situation. She believes that he is shifting the responsibility onto her. Sylvie claims that she never pretended, and that Christopher fell in love with Lady Katia of his own free will. The prince bent over in pain, wanting to argue. He was sure that the girl thought that he deserved it, and he accused her of always looking down on him. He called her the complete opposite of Katia, a devilishly cruel woman. Sylviana was already struggling to control herself, and Christopher's anger was growing. Sylvie realized that to Prince Christopher, she really was a villain. She believes that it was not malice at all, even though she was indeed thinking of her own good. Christopher shouted that he had been deprived of his right to the throne, and Katia still could not leave the temple. He continued to accuse Sylviana of destroying everything. Rage boiled in his eyes. He shouted that he hated Sylviana's gaze and even swung his fist at her. The prince wanted to hit the girl in the face, but she managed to stop him in time. He was confused and furious. Sylvie said that yes, maybe she was to blame. But Prince Christopher couldn't change anything with his fist. She couldn't understand why he and the prince couldn't be happy on their own. He could be with Lady Katia, and she could live a quiet life on the farm. Christopher wondered what kind of power Sylvie had used to stop his fist. But the girl just called the guy a weakling because she hadn't even used magic at that moment. She continued to hold his fist with the coldest gaze possible. Suddenly, she made Christopher fall to the floor and struck him with her power. The guy looked at her furiously from the floor, unable to get up because of his illness. Sylviana told him that if he tried, he could defeat the villain. And she asked if he was a prince, right? The girl thinks that blaming her for all the misfortunes is too childish. However, if she could turn back time, she would have told Christopher from the very beginning that she would devote her entire life to serving him while he gave his all to the country. And Sylvie would have stayed by his side if their paths had diverged. But before, she thought Christopher, loyal to the main character, was simply wonderful. The girl lay on the bed and literally stared at his beautiful photos back then. And now she stands before him and proudly defends herself. Christopher is lying on the floor, pounding it with his fists in anger. Suddenly, the guards saw this and were frightened for the prince. They sternly asked Sylviana what she had done to him. Suddenly, Prince Edgar appeared at the scene. He asked the guards to step aside and assured them that he would sort everything out himself. He ordered his brother to be taken away to rest. Sylvie saw Edgar and called out to him. He asked the girl what had happened and if she was okay. At that moment, Christopher cried out in pain and was sure that they were mocking him. They helped him up, but he still had trouble standing. Christopher was upset that Edgar called the girl simply Sylvie, that they were so close. He was convinced that Sylviana and Edgar had been friends since school. He accused them of conspiring to frame him. Sylvie started screaming that it wasn't true, and Edgar began to defend the girl. He said that Sylviana's innocence had already been confirmed by the Crystal of Time. Christopher yelled at them very loudly and accused them of taking everything away from him. The guards held his arms and tried to calm him down, and they quickly led him away. The prince was furious. Only Sylviana and Edgar remained in the corridor. He apologized to her on behalf of his brother. Sylvie replied that Edgar had nothing to apologize for. After all, he had already bowed before her family on behalf of the king. Edgar said that he had not expected such words from his father about the engagement. He apologized again for putting Sylvie in an awkward position. The girl replied that it was not necessary. In her opinion, the marriage proposal was a perfectly reasonable idea. Her family would have gladly accepted it, but because of the girl's selfishness, she didn't finish her sentence. Because she suddenly received a slap from Prince Edgar. He ordered her in a stern tone to speak honestly. Sylviana was surprised. She couldn't dodge the slap, and she began to say that everything was honest. She understood the meaning of the engagement, but still wanted to lead a quiet and measured life. By the way, she believed that there was nothing wrong with healthy selfishness. She put her hands on her hips and, with an important look, proved her honesty to the prince. But Edgar knew better. The girl continued and said that she felt sorry for Christopher. She understood that she had caused trouble for the royal family. Edgar stood right in front of her and began to calm her down. He said that the royal family had always bound the girl with obligations, and that it was perfectly normal not to want an engagement. Sylvie lowered her head and admitted that the farm was more important to her now, and she didn't have the strength to think about anything else. So she asked the prince not to think that she disliked him or anything like that. Edgar was a little embarrassed, his eyes widened. Sylviana thanked the prince for his support and said she was glad he understood her feelings. Edgar replied that he was happy to be her friend. They shook hands. Sylvie said that His Highness Christopher had told her earlier that Katia still couldn't leave the temple. She was curious to know the details. Edgar explained that Lady Katia had been hit hardest by the curse. Katia was in the temple to have the curse lifted. When she recovers, she will remain at the temple to work as a mage. Lady Katia was originally accepted into the academy because of her talent for healing magic. They say that she and Christopher are not allowed to see each other. Sylviana was saddened and did not expect to hear this. She thinks that Katia was probably also affected by the curse. Katia did not commit any crimes like Christopher, so this is a fair decision. Katia should have had a happy ending. But this is a curse. Edgar's words interrupted Sylviana's train of thought. He asked if they would go to the dungeon again tomorrow. The girl replied that they would, and asked if the prince could come to her. He replied that the actual succession to the throne was still a long way off, so yes, he confirmed that he would come. Sylvie then replied that they would meet at the farm. The young people said goodbye to each other on a friendly note. They smiled at each other and waved goodbye. Meanwhile, the royal corridor was empty. The room where Christopher was sitting was in complete disarray. There was blood smeared on the floor and walls, and dried rose petals were scattered everywhere. The paintings hung crookedly. The walls were torn. Only Prince Christopher, sick, held his head and dreamed of destroying everyone. He believed that everyone had laughed at him. His worthless father, his insolent brother who had stolen the throne, and Sylviana Melcarini. His rage still boiled within him. But he still remembered how, when he first met Sylviana, he thought about her beauty, that she was God's greatest creation. And at the same time, he felt a crushing defeat and the realization of the distance between them. At that time, he thought he was not her equal. And those huge eyes, looking straight at him then, Sylvie was assessing him. Christopher, a man whose abilities were not so great, even though he was the heir to the throne. Under Sylviana's gaze, which grew colder with age, Christopher was overcome with fear that one day she would seize royal power. And at that moment, a divine creature appeared before him. Bright light poured in from the window. Everything seemed unimaginable. Lady Katia appeared out of nowhere and called out to Mr. Christopher. He was shocked to see her. Finally, they had met. Katia looked at him with her big eyes full of hope. He timidly and stammeringly asked what she was doing there. Katia replied that she wanted to see him so badly that she even ran away from the temple. Christopher's eyes filled with tears. He said he missed her very much too. The girl took his face in her hands and sadly noted that he had lost a lot of weight, calling him poor thing. She wanted to help him, but she didn't have the strength to do so. But then it occurred to her that the main library might hold the key to breaking the curse. Katia's voice was very cheerful and gave him hope. She suggested that Prince Christopher join her in searching for this salvation. And immediately they found themselves in the library, among tall shelves and bookcases. Lady Katia found a book and showed it to Mr. Christopher. She added that with his mind and strength, he would surely succeed. He took the book in his hands and saw that it was called Entertaining Magic. At that moment, Katia put a small bracelet on Christopher's hand. It was her talisman, made especially for him. The girl looked at him with her lovely big eyes, smiled, and asked him to come for her as soon as possible. Suddenly, the divine light disappeared, and the library suddenly resembled Christopher's empty room. Only the talisman continued to glow. The image of Lady Katia faded into the darkness. The prince raved and promised to come for the girl. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.